My name is Elias Navarro, and I've always believed the Earth is honest. Rocks don't lie. A basalt column will tell you the story of cooling if you listen. Strata whisper history in their layers. That's what drew me to geology in the first place, a profession built on deciphering truth left in stone. But I didn't come to Alaska for truth. I came for work, and maybe, if I'm being honest, to hide from everything else. The small transport plane dropped me off on the edge of the Katmai volcanic valley, its black ridges jutting into the sky like broken teeth. The pilot didn't want to land. He circled 3 times before setting down on a rough strip carved into the permafrost. When he handed me my supply crates, he didn't meet my eyes. 2 weeks, he said. No more. Then he was gone, the sound of the propeller vanishing into a sky that looked more like ash than cloud. The valley greeted me with silence, except for the hissing of vents that dotted the terrain. They exhaled pale steam into the freezing air, a constant chorus of whispers rising from the ground. The smell hit next, sulfur, sharp and chemical, burning the back of my throat. Beneath my boots, the earth felt uneven, like there was something moving far below, shifting against the crust. I told myself it was the usual geothermal instability. I told myself that as I set up camp near a fractured ridge where obsidian jutted out of the ground like blades. But by the second hour, I'd already noticed the first wrong detail. The steam carried a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind funneling through rock, producing high-pitched tones the way bottles do when you blow across their lips. But this was different, too patterned. There were cadences, shapes in the noise, fragments that resembled words. I stopped, held my breath, and the valley exhaled again. Elias. I spun, nearly dropping my sample kit. My name. Clear as someone calling from behind a curtain of mist. No one was supposed to be here. That was the point. This valley had been closed off for decades after the last eruption. The only records were from satellite imagery and distant flyovers. My mission was to log new fissures, measure temperatures, and sample mineral deposits to see if there was any chance of geothermal harnessing. It was empty land, abandoned by man. So, how could the valley know my name? I worked late that first night, forcing myself to ignore the whispers. I set up my instruments, drove thermal rods into the ground, and recorded data by headlamp. The numbers were odd, temperatures spiking higher than predicted, readings fluctuating as if heat pockets were traveling beneath the surface. I told myself it was magma migration, though my training told me that didn't make sense this close to the surface without activity. The cold bit deeper after sundown. I crawled into my tent, zipper drawn tight, ears stuffed with foam plugs. Still, through the thin nylon, I felt the valley's breath. Steam hissed and curled, brushing the fabric like fingers. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was pacing just outside. The second wrong detail came with dawn. I unzipped the tent and found prints in the ash. Human-shaped, bare feet pressed into the brittle surface around my camp. Too wide, too long, with toes splayed unnaturally far apart. They circled my tent once before vanishing toward the fissures. I knelt and touched one. Warm. The ground trembled under my hand, a faint rolling shiver, like something massive shifting miles below. And then, through the rising steam, I heard the voice again. Help me. This time, it wasn't my name. But it was close enough that the syllables snagged on recognition, the way you recognize a word shouted in a foreign language. A plea, mangled but human. Every instinct told me to stay inside camp, radio the station, demand early extraction. But my pride didn't let me. I'm a geologist, a scientist. I've walked lava tubes in Iceland, hiked alone into Atacama salt flats, crawled through caves where one wrong turn meant death. If there was an explanation here, I'd find it. I strapped on my pack and followed the prints into the mist. The tracks curved along the slope, sometimes vanishing under patches of frozen scree, then reappearing darker and wetter near fissures where steam roared upward. Each step I took crunched against brittle volcanic glass. The air carried a strange wet metal tang like rust boiling in water. My gloves couldn't keep the damp cold from biting into my fingertips. I stopped at the edge of a vent. The ground trembled beneath me, faint but rhythmic, like a heartbeat, too slow, too deep. Steam blasted upward, warming my face for an instant, then fading again, leaving only the stench of sulfur. Through that hiss, I heard it. Down here. It was a voice. Human. Pleading. Every part of me wanted to believe some lost traveler had wandered here. That the plane I'd seen vanish over the ridges had dropped someone else. That I wasn't alone in this graveyard of rock and steam. But the rational part of me, the geologist, the scientist, clung to doubt. The valley distorted sound, the fissures amplified pressure releases into patterns. It could explain voices. It had to. I crouched, peered into the vent. Blackness below, shifting with faint orange glows, like distant embers stirring. The heat rising from it should have been unbearable, yet the steam rolled cool against my cheeks. Wrong. The kind of wrong that prickled the back of my neck and made me take a step back. The prince led away, climbing toward a basalt ridge that cut across the valley floor. My breath fogged in front of me as I climbed. Each exhale sounded louder than it should, echoing strangely. Once, God help me, I swore I heard my own breathing answer back, half a second behind, like someone walking just behind me, mimicking. By the time I reached the ridge, my nerves were pulled taut. I stood, chest heaving, surveying the valley below. My camp looked impossibly small, a dot of orange nylon in a sea of gray ash. Beyond it, fissures exhaled in unison, their steam columns rising like signals. For a moment, I swore they aligned into shapes, like figures standing shoulder to shoulder, before dispersing into the wind. I whispered aloud, "You're tired, Elias. That's all." And then something answered in perfect Spanish, my mother tongue. "Tienes razón, Elias. You're right, Elias." I nearly lost my footing. My name again, my own language. No distortion now, no doubt. It was meant for me. Panic clawed at my chest. I forced myself to keep moving, eyes fixed on the ground so I wouldn't have to see the steam twist into familiar forms. My boots caught another set of prints, fresh ones, too crisp to be old. They overlapped with the strange wide-footed tracks I'd seen earlier, like something human walked side by side with something not human. My stomach churned. That mixture of fear and stubborn resolve pushed me deeper along the ridge. Halfway across, I noticed the silence. The vents had stopped. The constant hiss I'd grown accustomed to was gone. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. My ears rang with the absence of it as though the world had muted itself. Then, an echo. Not a voice this time. My own footsteps. I froze, lifted one boot, and stomped down. A beat later, behind me, the same impact. Precise, delayed. My throat went dry. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head. The ridge was empty. Nothing behind me but the churn of pale mist. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that someone was there. Watching. Waiting. I forced myself onward, but every step doubled. My pace quickened, and so did the echo. Faster, louder, until I was practically running, sliding down the far side of the ridge into a narrow basin where vents spat intermittent bursts of steam. I collapsed to my knees, chest heaving, sweat freezing against my skin. My radio crackled at my belt. For the first time since arrival, I grabbed it, thumb trembling on the switch. "This is Elias Navarro, field geologist, ID 298. I'm static." A hiss. Then my voice played back to me, distorted but recognizable. "Elias Navarro, field geologist, ID 298. The valley was speaking me, repeating me, consuming me. I threw the radio down, the clatter echoing in the basin like gunshots. And in that same moment, something moved in the steam. Not fully visible, just the outline of a head and shoulders, taller than any man, blurred by the vapor. It lingered at the edge of my vision, retreating whenever I turned, advancing when I looked away. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of shifting pressure, refracted light. But my body didn't believe it. My body screamed danger. The trembling beneath the ground intensified. Not random now. Steps. Heavy. Deliberate. I pressed myself against a basalt wall, my hands scraping sharp edges. My training told me to observe, to measure, to gather data, even in fear. I pulled my thermal scanner from my pack, aimed it at the mist. The display bloomed red, then white hot. Off the charts. No body of flesh could radiate that heat and still stand. And yet the silhouette loomed closer, its outline sharpening. Arms too long, head cocked at an unnatural angle, mouth open though no features should have been there. I snapped the scanner shut, heart pounding. Science had no category for this. "Stay calm," I muttered to myself. "Back to camp. Back to camp." The mist shifted. The figure was gone, but the footprints appeared in front of me one by one, pressing into the ash as if an invisible giant were walking straight toward me. My fight or flight broke. I fled. I don't remember the sprint back across the ridge. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and the valley's voice chased me every step. It whispered in Spanish, in English, in tongues I couldn't name. It used my voice. It used my mother's voice. It even used the voice of a professor long dead, the one who taught me to read stone. When I finally stumbled into camp, the tent loomed like a lifeboat in a storm. I dove inside, zipped the door, pressed my back to the nylon as though it were armor. My breath rattled too loud in the silence. Outside, the ground trembled again. Closer. Heavier. Steam hissed, but not random now. It rose in steady pulses, timed, deliberate, almost like breathing. And through it, faint but unmistakable, I heard knocking. 3 knocks. On the outside of my tent. The nylon of my tent quivered with each knock. Soft, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was out there wanted to remind me that it knew I was inside. I froze. My first instinct was to grab the knife from my pack, but the absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. A blade against what? Steam? Heat? Voices? Still, my hand closed around the handle, slick with sweat. The knocks came again. 3 slow raps, patient. Waiting. I forced myself to whisper, "Who's there?" No answer at first, just the hiss of steam outside venting in irregular bursts. Then, my own voice, right outside the nylon. "Who's there?" Identical, down to the exact tremor in tone. I clamped a hand over my mouth. My heart thundered so loud I feared it would give me away, though the thing already knew. It always knew. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. I don't know how long I sat like that, crouched in the dark of my tent with the knife pressed against my thigh. Minutes. Hours. Time didn't feel linear anymore. It bent and folded like the ridges of this volcanic valley, twisting my sense of direction. The air inside the tent grew thick, warm, damp. My breath fogged my glasses until I took them off and sat half blind. Then the smell changed. It wasn't sulfur anymore. It was iron, like fresh blood. Metallic and sweet, filling the air so strongly it burned the inside of my nose. I gagged, unzipped the tent flap an inch for air, and saw an eye staring back at me. Not human. Too wide, too black, reflecting no light at all. Steam curled around it as though it were exhaling mist directly into the world. I recoiled, zipped the flap shut, fell backward into my supplies. My hand knocked over the thermal scanner, and that's when I made my mistake. I turned it on. Through the thin nylon, the scanner lit up bright as a torch. A figure towered just outside, radiating impossible heat. Limbs too long, shoulders hunched, head tilted unnaturally. It was so close that the display maxed out in white glare. The tent shuddered as something dragged a finger or claw along its surface. Slowly, deliberately. The sound was high-pitched, a tearing squeal that set every nerve in my body on edge. My instincts screamed, "Get out! Stay mobile. Don't let yourself be cornered." I slung my pack over my shoulders, unzipped the opposite side of the tent, and bolted into the freezing mist. The valley felt alive now. Every vent hissed in rhythm, a chorus of whispers rising and falling, almost chanting. My boots slipped on ash and ice as I ran, lungs heaving. The voices followed me. They used names, my name, my father's, my sister's. At one point, I heard my childhood nickname, one only my late mother had used. Lido. I nearly tripped, the sound slicing deeper than any knife could. But I couldn't stop. I needed distance, needed a vantage point. The ridge loomed ahead again, jagged like a spine cutting through the earth. I scrambled up its face, hands bleeding as sharp basalt tore my palms. Every step felt like climbing against gravity itself. When I reached the top, the valley stretched out below in its vast, smoking desolation. My camp, a flicker of orange fabric, was half collapsed now, as though something had trampled through it. Steam vents exhaled in perfect intervals, no longer chaotic but synchronized. And then I saw it clearly for the first time, the shape moving through the mist. It was tall, hunched, its limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, if it could be called that, glowed faintly, like molten rock cooling into obsidian. Its mouth opened and closed, releasing bursts of steam that carried voices. Not one voice, but dozens, layered, overlapping, imitating. I couldn't breathe. My mind, desperate for order, tried to categorize it. Volcanic gas phenomenon? Heat distortion? But there was no category for this thing. It wasn't just using the valley, it was the valley. A consciousness born of heat and pressure and trapped voices, something ancient that had learned how to mimic us through steam and sound. It tilted its head upward. It knew where I was. I ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering against my ribs. The ground trembled with its steps, not fast, but purposeful. Hunting. I forced my mind to think like a scientist. This thing moved with heat. It radiated energy, enough to distort instruments. Maybe that was its weakness. Maybe if I could lead it toward a fissure venting cooler steam, the sudden temperature shift might destabilize it, or at least slow it down. It was a gamble, but better than waiting to be dragged into whatever abyss it came from. I clutched the thermal scanner, watching its glow on the display as the figure closed in. Its heat signature flared white-hot, nearly blinding. I timed my breaths with the hissing vents, then darted from cover, sprinting down the ridge toward the fissure field. The voices erupted at once. Dozens, screaming, pleading, laughing. Some cried my name, some begged for mercy, others whispered promises. My father's voice telling me I'd be safe, my professor urging me forward. I clamped my hands over my ears, teeth gritted, and kept running. The fissures gaped ahead, mouths in the earth exhaling pale vapor. I picked the largest one, where the steam billowed cold against my face. My lungs burned as I reached it, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Behind me, the ground shook harder. The figure emerged from the mist, closer than ever. Its mouth opened wide, releasing a deafening chorus of voices, my own among them. In desperation, I grabbed a thermal rod from my pack, the kind we used for temperature probes, and jammed it into the fissure's edge. The metal sizzled, readings spiking wildly. I aimed the scanner toward the creature and shouted, "Come on!" It came. The mist swirled, its body elongating, stretching, as though drawn toward the cooler steam. For a moment, I believed it was working, that I'd found some way to repel it. Then it leaned forward, impossibly close now, and whispered in perfect Spanish, "Te encontré." I found you. The heat slammed into me like a wave. My skin blistered, my vision seared white. I staggered back, fell onto the ash, gasping. The fissure roared, steam exploding upward. The figure dissolved into it, scattering but not gone. Never gone. The valley went silent again. Only the hiss of vents, irregular once more. Only the sound of my ragged breathing. I lay there, trembling, the smell of burned fabric and scorched hair clinging to me. My skin stung with raw heat, but I was alive. Somehow. But the words lingered, echoing in my skull. I found you. The thing had let me live. Or maybe it didn't need to kill me. Maybe survival was worse. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled beneath me. The ground was still hot where the fissure had vented, searing through the fabric of my pants. My skin throbbed, raw and wet. For a long moment, I stayed there on all fours, breathing in ash and sulfur, coughing until I nearly vomited. The mist drifted across the valley in slow sheets, covering and uncovering the black ridges like curtains. Every time it shifted, I expected the shape to reappear, looming, whispering, waiting. But there was nothing. Only emptiness. That silence was worse than noise. It meant I had no idea where it was. My body screamed at me to leave, to call the pilot on the emergency frequency, demand an early pickup, walk until my legs broke if I had to. I staggered upright, clutching the thermal scanner like a talisman, and turned toward the ridge that marked the way back to the rough landing strip. I hadn't taken 10 steps before the valley moved against me. It started as a tremor under my boots, gentle, rhythmic, almost like before. But then, the ground cracked, a jagged line tearing across the ash and blocking my path. Steam roared upward, carrying the smell of burning hair, though nothing was there to burn. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The fissure split wider, forcing me to retreat toward the basin instead of the ridge. The valley didn't want me to leave. "No," I muttered, voice breaking. "No, no, no." I pushed forward anyway, skirting the new fissure, climbing over boulders, refusing to let myself collapse into panic. The slope rose beneath my feet. With every step, the air grew heavier, hotter. Sweat rolled down my temples, even though the wind cut sharp as knives across my face. And then the voices started again. Not whispers this time. Laughter. Low, guttural chuckles that slid into shrill, mocking cackles. They echoed across the rocks, bouncing from vent to vent until it felt like the entire valley was laughing at me. I pressed my palms over my ears. It didn't help. The sound came from inside, reverberating in my skull. One voice rose above the others. Deep, confident. My own voice. "You won't leave, Elias." I stumbled, nearly falling. My lips had moved, I had said it myself, but the sound had come from elsewhere, from the steam, from everywhere. I broke into a sprint. The ridge was close now, its black spine cutting into the gray sky. If I could crest it, maybe I'd see the strip, maybe I'd catch a signal on the emergency beacon. Anything. But as I reached the top, my stomach dropped. The valley on the other side was wrong. It wasn't the tundra plain I'd crossed when the pilot dropped me off. It wasn't the winding cut of frozen riverbed leading to the strip. It was the same valley, the same fissures, the same steaming vents, the same jagged basalt teeth. I blinked, rubbed at my eyes until they burned, but nothing changed. Somehow, impossibly, I had looped back into the same place. I screamed, the sound torn from me without thought. My voice cracked across the mist, swallowed instantly by the valley. And then, of course, it came back. The echo wasn't perfect. It came too fast. It came in chorus. A dozen voices, all mine, screaming back at me. I fell to my knees, my rational mind, my scientist's mind, fractured against the impossibility. Sound doesn't multiply. Landscapes don't loop. But here they did, and the truth of the earth, the honesty I'd built my life on, was gone. The ash shifted under my palms. When I looked down, the prints were there again, bare, wide feet with long splayed toes. They trailed away from me, circling, multiplying, until they formed a ring around where I knelt. I staggered up, spinning in place, knife raised. The mist thickened, and through it shapes began to form. Not one figure now. Dozens. Tall, thin silhouettes moving in rhythm, their limbs bending in ways that mocked the human form. They swayed with the steam, always half hidden, never solid, yet undeniably there. The voices rose in unison, layered and deafening. Some cried, some begged, some whispered intimate things, confessions I'd never spoken aloud. One used the voice of a woman I'd loved once, years ago, telling me she forgave me. Another spoke in the voice of my father who had died when I was a boy. I clutched my head, staggering backward, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't tell if they were mine or if the valley was weeping with me. And then, just as suddenly, silence fell. The shapes stilled. The voices cut off mid-syllable. The mist parted, revealing a narrow path between two basalt towers, a corridor, almost inviting. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap. But staying here, surrounded by the ring of shadows, wasn't an option. My legs moved without permission, carrying me down the path. The ash crunched underfoot, echoing in the quiet like gunshots. The corridor narrowed, the walls of basalt pressing close, slick with condensation. Steam dripped like sweat. The air grew so hot it seared my throat with every breath. I forced myself forward, stumbling, half delirious from the heat. And then I emerged into a hollow. The ground here was black glass, smooth and reflective. Steam vented from cracks along the edges, curling upward in perfect spirals. And in the center stood a figure, not a shadow this time, not half-formed. It looked exactly like me. Every detail. Same clothes, same scorched skin, same bleeding palms. It even held a knife in its hand, just as I did. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. Then it smiled. I hadn't smiled in hours. The thing tilted its head, lips moving silently before a voice. My voice slid into the air without sound. I couldn't hear it, not with my ears. I felt it, vibrating inside my chest, inside my skull. Stay. The ground trembled. Cracks spread across the glass, glowing red from the heat below. I staggered back, knife trembling in my hand, unable to look away from my own face smiling at me with a stranger's hunger. The fissures opened wider, the valley exhaled, and I knew, with a clarity colder than the Alaskan wind, that there was no escape, not from the valley, not from the thing, not from myself. The glass floor beneath me cracked wider, the glow of molten earth searing upward like veins of fire. My double didn't flinch. It stood in the center, smiling, the reflection of the flames painting its face in shifting orange. The knife in its hand hung loose, casual, as though it had all the time in the world. "Stay," it said again, this time aloud. My own voice, my own cadence. "I'm leaving," I croaked. My throat burned with the heat, my words breaking like brittle stone. The double tilted its head. The smile never faltered. "You can't." Something in the way it said it, flat, factual, not cruel, not mocking, tore at me worse than laughter would have. Because I believed it, the cracks raced outward. Steam hissed up through them, carrying voices. Thousands now, a storm of memory and mimicry. I heard people I'd lost, people I'd studied with, strangers I'd brushed shoulders with in airports. Every word I'd ever spoken seemed to hang in that air, recycled, used against me. I backed toward the basalt wall. The heat of it seared my shoulder through my jacket. No exit, no path, only the hollow and the figure. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped my knife. What good was it? Steel against heat, against sound, against something that wore my face like a mask. And yet clinging to it kept me from unraveling completely. The double stepped closer. Its boots struck the glass without sound, though cracks spidered out with every step. My chest heaved, each breath ripping through lungs that felt lined with ash. "Why me?" I whispered. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head the other direction, studying me like a specimen. For the first time, its smile faded. "Because you listen." The words fell heavy, final. I wanted to argue, to deny, to insist that I was just a man with instruments here for samples and data, but I thought of the way I had paused at the first voice in the mist, the way I'd followed prints that should not exist. My own curiosity had led me step by step into its grasp, and in some terrible way, it was right. I had listened. The hollow shook violently. A fissure burst open behind the figure, spraying scalding steam. It dissolved in the cloud, its form unraveling, until only the echo of my own face lingered in the vapor. The voices screamed as one. I ran. I don't remember choosing a direction, only that the basalt corridor narrowed again and I forced myself through. My skin peeled against the hot rock, but I kept moving, half crawling, half scrambling, until I stumbled back into the open valley. The air here was freezing compared to the hollow, burning my lungs with cold relief. Mist rolled across the ground, no longer synchronized, just random, chaotic. For one fragile moment, I thought I'd escaped. Then I looked back. The hollow's entrance was gone. Nothing but smooth basalt ridge where the corridor had been. A hysterical laugh ripped out of me, echoing across the ash. The valley answered instantly. My laugh multiplied, distorted, mocking. I clapped a hand over my mouth and ran. I didn't stop until I collapsed beside the ruins of my tent. The fabric was shredded, poles bent at wrong angles. My supplies were scattered across the ash, some burned, some wet with condensation. The radio lay cracked, its battery pack melted. I crawled inside what was left of the tent and curled against the cold ground, knife clutched against my chest like a child's toy. The valley hissed around me, whispering, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English, sometimes in voices I didn't recognize. But none of them crossed the threshold. Not that night. When the gray light of morning finally bled across the valley, I staggered outside. My body ached, burned, half dehydrated. I gathered what I could salvage, some water, a few unspoiled food packs, and started walking. I didn't know if I was heading toward the landing strip or deeper into the same looping valley. Every ridge looked the same. Every fissure hissed in mockery. Hours passed, maybe days. Time dissolved. The mist carried sunless light that never shifted. My GPS spun without sense. My compass needle jittered like it had gone mad. But I kept walking, because the alternative was to listen again. And I knew now what happened if I listened too closely. At some point, whether by miracle or design, I stumbled onto the strip. A scar of frozen earth scraped flat among the basalt, the same one the pilot had left me on, or one made to look like it. The emergency beacon flickered there, still in its case, though I swore I'd never unpacked it. I staggered toward it on numb legs, pressed the transmitter with what little strength remained. The signal light blinked red, then green. Somewhere, impossibly far, the plane would be coming back. I collapsed beside it, staring at the horizon, where steam rose in endless curtains. For a long time, the valley was quiet. No laughter, no whispers, no footsteps behind mine. And then, faint as breath, just as my eyes fluttered shut, it came. Elias, my name, carried on the steam, not cruel, not mocking, just there, waiting. I don't know if the pilot ever saw me wave. I don't know if I ever left that valley at all. All I know is that I still hear it sometimes, even now in the hiss of pipes, in the sigh of wind through cracks in city streets. And I wonder, if I listened too closely, whether it would answer again. My name is Captain Elias Navarro, and I've spent most of my adult life fighting in places where the air reeked of cordite, where walls were more whole than stone, and where sleep never lasted longer than the sound of the next shot. I've carried men out of burning Humvees, stitched wounds with trembling fingers, and stared down the barrel of inevitability more times than I care to admit. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in those years of combat prepared me for the silence I met in the Alaskan interior. They called it a weather station. I knew better. The government has dozens of these facilities scattered across the far north, hidden in places so inhospitable that you could walk a mile in the wrong direction and vanish into white oblivion. On paper, the job was simple. My team and I were to check why Station 57 hadn't reported in for 72 hours. Bad weather, maybe. A frozen generator, maybe. A simple in and out. The kind of operation we'd run countless times, though usually with bullets flying. Except the helicopter that brought us over the jagged mountain spine hit turbulence so hard it damn near snapped us in half. We dropped lower, snow smashing against the windshield like gravel, and the pilot shouted something I couldn't hear. The rest of my team, 2 men I trusted with my life, were shaking their heads when we touched down on an ice shelf short of the station. The bird couldn't make it any farther. With visibility dropping, the pilot made the call. Stay put or hike in. I hiked in. Alone. It was supposed to be 2 miles. In a place like that, 2 miles can stretch into eternity. The snow dragged at my boots like it wanted to keep me. Wind clawed at my face until the skin went raw. The smell was nothing, just sterile ice, like walking into a freezer that stretched across the world. My breath rasped in my ears, muffled by the balaclava, and even that sound seemed too loud. Because here's the thing. In all that empty white, I kept hearing something else. At first, it was just a trick of the wind. Long moans that bent between the rocks, harmonics that made the air seem alive. But then it changed. The pitch rose, fell, then wove together like voices. More than one, a chorus just on the edge of hearing. I froze, knees locking in place, snow piling on my parka. It sounded like my team. Not clearly, just fragments. A grunt that might have been Ramirez, the low whistle Vasquez made when he was nervous. My stomach knotted. I'd seen auditory illusions in the desert before. Heat shimmer playing tricks, adrenaline pulling faces out of shadows. But there was no heat here. No life to distort perception. Just the cold and the endless white. I kept moving. When I reached the station, the sun was little more than a dull smear behind the clouds. The place rose out of the snow like a half-buried carcass. 3 prefab cabins connected by narrow walkways. A central antenna tower leaning at an unnatural angle and drifts swallowing most of the siding. No footprints. No tire tracks. Just smooth, untouched snow that gleamed like glass. The door to the main cabin was frozen shut. I shouldered it until the latch cracked, then stumbled into darkness. The stench hit me first. Metal, stale coffee, and something else. Something like iron, sharp enough to coat the back of my tongue. I pulled off my goggles, blinking in the dim light. The generator hummed weakly, but the overhead bulbs flickered, each one stuttering in rhythm with the wind outside. "Station 57, this is Navarro," I called into the stillness. My voice sounded like it didn't belong to me, bouncing back from the narrow walls. No answer. The cabin was cluttered with gear. Charts pinned to corkboards, mugs frozen to desks, radios stacked in a corner like discarded bones. And silence. Not the natural silence of a place abandoned, but a waiting kind of silence, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then, faint, from down the hall, "Cap?" I whipped around so fast I nearly tore the strap from my rifle. My pulse thundered. That was Ramirez's voice. I knew it. Deep, clipped, always sounding like he was half out of patience. "Ramirez?" My voice cracked. I forced myself steady. "Where the hell are you?" No reply. Just the wind pressing against the siding, rattling it like a giant hand shaking a toy house. I checked every room. Empty bunks, desks with frozen screens, lockers left open, but not a single soul. And yet, I could have sworn the sound had come from no more than 10 feet away. My training screamed at me. Do not trust your senses. Fear warps them, darkness warps them, isolation warps them. I set up in the comms room, hoping to power the radio. The equipment was ice cold, its dials stiff, as if the station hadn't seen heat in days. I flicked switches, breathed warmth onto my fingers, coaxed life from machines that wanted to stay dead. The generator whined in protest. The static on the radio rose, fell, then crackled like fire. And beneath it, so faint I almost missed it, someone whispered my name. Elias. Not Navarro, not Captain, not the clipped call sign my men used. No, this was soft, drawn out, intimate, a voice I hadn't heard in years. My sister. She died when I was 19, long before I ever wore a uniform. I hadn't thought of her voice in so long that hearing it there, in that frozen place, was like being punched in the chest. For a second I couldn't breathe. I slammed the radio off. The wind outside roared like it was laughing. That night, I call it night, though the sun never really dipped below the horizon, I sat with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap, listening. The voices came and went, threaded into the storm. Sometimes they sounded like Ramirez and Vasquez, sometimes like my sister, sometimes like men I'd lost years ago on other continents. Once, I swear, I heard my own voice, calm and steady, telling me to go outside. I didn't move. I knew the danger wasn't just the cold. Something here wanted me to listen. Wanted me to follow, and the longer I stayed, the harder it was to resist. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time my eyelids dipped, the station seemed to shift around me. The generator thumped like a failing heartbeat. The walls groaned under pressure, and the voices slid through the cracks in the siding like icy fingers. They never shouted, never rose above a whisper, but they threaded themselves into my thoughts until I couldn't tell where memory ended and hallucination began. The military teaches you to compartmentalize, one task at a time, one breath at a time. I clung to that discipline. At dawn, though the sky looked no different from midnight, I forced myself into routine. Water first, food second, radio third. Survival was always about order. I melted snow on a camping stove I'd found abandoned on the counter, poured the lukewarm water into a dented canteen. The smell of propane mixed with dust sharp in my nose, grounding me. When I tried the radio again, the static swelled until it sounded almost human. Fragments bled through, half a syllable here, a cough there. Then, unmistakably, "Cap! Come outside!" I gritted my teeth. No, not happening. My own voice startled me. It echoed too long, like the walls were listening. I checked the perimeter instead. My boots crunched on fresh snow that should have been untouched since I arrived, but wasn't. Tracks led from the edge of the station's walkway toward the tree line. Bare footprints. Human. The size of my own. I crouched, breath fogging, heart pounding against my ribs. No boot tread, no insulation, just naked flesh pressed into snow so cold it would kill in minutes. The prints stopped halfway across the yard. Just stopped, like whoever made them had dissolved into the storm. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight. My training told me to retreat, re-establish defensible ground. My pride told me to follow, to prove to myself there was an explanation. I compromised. I memorized the pattern, photographed it with the old station camera, and went back inside. By midday, the walls were closing in. I sat at the desk, turning a broken pen in my hands, trying not to listen. But the voices didn't stop. They adjusted. They learned. First, they mimicked Ramirez's easy swagger. "You think you're the only one tough enough to make it? Come on, Cap. We're waiting." Then Vasquez, rough and low. "You left us, hermano. Don't make it worse." Each time I swallowed bile, forced myself to focus on the present. But the one that broke me wasn't theirs. It was my sister again. "Elias," she whispered, her tone caught between sadness and warmth. "Please, it's so cold out here." I clenched the rifle until my knuckles went numb. "You're not real. You know I am. You never said goodbye." My vision blurred. I pressed the heel of my hand to my eyes until colors sparked. Discipline was slipping, and I knew it. The worst battlefield isn't out there in the snow. It's inside your head when you can't trust what it feeds you. That's when I heard it. Not a whisper this time, not carried by the wind. A thud. Heavy. Direct. On the roof. I froze. My ears strained until every nerve felt raw. Another thud, closer to the edge. Then a slow drag like something crawling over corrugated metal. I snapped the safety off my rifle, moved toward the window. Outside, snow lashed sideways, aurora light rippling green across the clouds. Nothing moved on the roof. Nothing human, at least. The dragging stopped. I backed into the comms room, every instinct screaming at me to stay low, stay quiet. Then, without warning, 3 sharp knocks rattled the door. I aimed down the sights, breath shallow. "Cap?" A voice, muffled through the steel. Ramirez again. "Too perfect, too casual. Open up, man. You're locking me out." My finger trembled against the trigger. "You're not here." The knocks came again, louder. "Don't do this. It's freezing. You want me to die out here?" The rational part of me knew Ramirez couldn't have made it from the helicopter. The pilot had turned back. I'd seen it with my own eyes. Still, my heart hammered, traitorous, wanting to believe. "Go away," I rasped. "You're not him." Silence. I counted to 60, gun leveled, waiting for the next sound. When it came, it wasn't at the door. It was behind me. "Cap," a voice breathed, close enough that I felt the air stir against my ear. I spun, slammed into the desk, nearly firing. Nothing there. Nothing but the flicker of a dying bulb and the walls closing in. That was when I realized the truth. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't outside. Not anymore. It was inside the station with me. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I barricaded doors with overturned tables, dragged lockers across hallways, set up tripwires with spare wire. Old habits from black site work, from keeping sleep-deprived hostiles at bay. But even as I worked, I knew it was futile. You can fortify against bullets, against fire. You can't fortify against sound. Against something that knew your past and wore it like a mask. That night, the whispers changed. They no longer called my name. They laughed. At first a chuckle, low and mocking, then rising into a chorus that filled the cabin like smoke. Male, female, familiar, strange. All blending together until my eardrums buzzed. I pressed my palms against my ears, shouted until my throat tore. Still, the sounds seeped through bone. I fired once, out of desperation. An empty hallway, muzzle flash bleaching the dark. For a second, the laughter cut off. Then, in the silence, I heard a single voice whisper, my own voice. "You can't leave." I don't remember sleeping, but at some point exhaustion pinned me down. When I opened my eyes again, light filtered weakly through frosted windows. My barricades still stood. The rifle lay across my chest. Everything was the same, except for the footprints. They started at the far wall of the comms room, impossible because there was no door there, no way in, and crossed straight to where I slept. Bare, human, identical to the ones I'd seen outside. They stopped inches from my cot, toes pointed at me, and melted into nothing. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed for me to tear down the barricades, charge into the snow, and put as much distance between myself and Station 57 as humanly possible. But there was nowhere to go. The storm was a wall of knives, and 2 miles in that white hell might as well have been 200. So I did what soldiers do when retreat isn't an option. I prepared. I scavenged every corner of the station, extra propane canisters, freeze-dried rations, a pack of flares, a med kit with half-frozen syringes. I stuffed what I could into my ruck, every motion mechanical, disciplined. That discipline was the only wall between me and panic. If I stopped to think about the footprints, about the voices, about the impossibility of what I'd seen, I would have shattered. The voices didn't stop while I worked. They shifted tone, probing. My sister again, soft and coaxing. Elias, you don't have to be afraid. Ramirez, angry now. You're losing it, Cap. Open the damn door. Then strangers I didn't know, men, women, children, laughing, crying, whispering words I couldn't make out. They overlapped until they became a language of madness, a litany pounding at the edges of my skull. By late evening, the storm eased, not stopped, never stopped, but the whiteout gave way to blurred outlines of trees, ridges in the distance. The aurora bled across the sky in green curtains, shimmering like a living thing. The voices grew quieter, almost expectant. That's when I made my choice. If the thing wanted me inside, if it wanted me caged and cornered, then I'd flip the script. Take the fight outside. Force it onto ground where my training gave me some edge. I armed myself with 2 flares, my rifle, and a line of paracord I could trail behind me like breadcrumbs. I waited until the wind lulled, then shouldered the door open. The cold hit like a hammer. My lungs seized, my skin burned, even through the layers. Snow crunched under my boots. Too loud, too sharp. Every sound was amplified. The creak of the tower in the distance, the groan of shifting ice, the rasp of my own breath. I followed the old footprints, or what was left of them. They hadn't filled in, not completely, as if the storm itself refused to erase them. They led past the antenna toward the tree line. I kept my rifle raised, sweeping arcs across the white. Nothing but shadows of pines bending and twisting under the aurora glow. Then came the first voice. My own, drifting through the trees, over here. I froze. The sound was perfect. Pitch, cadence, the faint rasp of frost in my throat. It wasn't an echo. It was me, speaking from the dark. I fired into the trees. The shot cracked like thunder, rolling across the ice. Splinters burst from a trunk. The voice stopped. Silence. Then laughter. It came from everywhere at once, layered and chaotic. Men laughing, women laughing, children giggling. The sound danced across the snow, skittered across the ice, climbed up into the sky. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached, fired again, just to shut it out. The laughter cut off like a switch. Then the forest moved. At first it was subtle, a ripple, like branches swaying. But then I saw it. Shadows shifting where no wind touched, shapes gliding between the trees. Not bodies, not fully, just impressions of form. A shoulder, a head, a hand stretched too long. They flickered in and out of sight, like reflections on glass. I stumbled back, dragging the paracord, my chest heaving. The aurora above bent with the shapes, colors warping, green bleeding into red. My breath crystallized in frantic bursts. Elias, they whispered, dozens of voices in unison. My name stretched, twisted. Elias, stay. I fired until the rifle clicked empty. The recoil jarred me back to reality. Cold mechanics, metal in my hands. I dropped the weapon, yanked a flare from my belt, struck it. Red light spilled across the snow, harsh and unnatural. The shadows recoiled, bending away, vanishing between the trees. The voices hissed in frustration, the sound stabbing into my skull. I ran, boots pounding, flare in one hand, paracord in the other. My lungs burned, legs screamed, but I didn't stop. The shadows followed, darting at the edge of the light, pressing in whenever the flare sputtered. Their whispers clawed at my ears, each one tugging at memory, trying to break me down. My mother's lullabies, my squad mates' last breaths, my own voice, steady and calm, telling me to lay down and rest. I screamed back, raw and furious. You don't get to take me. The flare died. Darkness swallowed me. I yanked the second flare, hands shaking, struck it against the casing. It sputtered, caught, burned bright. Shadows peeled back again, but closer this time. Too close. One darted across my path. Half-formed, tall and angular, eyes burning like frost fire. I swung the flare at it, light searing its edges until it dissolved into mist. Finally, through the blur of snow and trees, I saw the station. My cord led me straight to the door, half buried in drift. I threw myself inside, slammed it shut, dropped the flare to the floor. The light flickered, casting blood-red arcs across the walls. The whispers didn't stop. They pressed against the siding, seething, 1,000 voices speaking in tongues I didn't understand. The walls groaned under their weight. I pressed my back against the door, shaking, teeth chattering. Then, silence. Total, suffocating silence. I looked up. The flare burned steady, but in its light I saw something I'd missed before. Words carved into the far wall of the comms room. Rough, shallow letters gouged into metal with desperate hands. Don't listen. The letters trembled in the red glow. Fresh. As if someone had just carved them. I don't know how long I sat staring at that message. Don't listen. The letters cut ragged, shallow, but deep enough that my gloved fingertips caught the grooves. My pulse rattled against my throat. Someone had been here before me. Someone who'd heard the same whispers, fought the same thing. But there were no bodies, no frozen corpses in bunks, no signs of struggle. Just silence and those words. That meant one of two things. Either they made it out or they didn't make it far enough to leave remains. The flare sputtered to ash. Darkness seeped in again, thick and total. I pulled my headlamp on, beams slashing across the room. The walls looked smaller in its circle of light, like the metal was bending inward. My breath echoed in my mask. I forced myself to the comms console. Routine. One step at a time, hands steady, eyes forward. I flicked the main power, adjusted the frequency dials, and keyed the mic. This is Captain Elias Navarro at Station 57. Emergency situation. Immediate extraction required. My voice came out hard, stripped of emotion, the way you talk when you don't dare let fear through the cracks. Static swallowed me whole. I repeated it. Again. Each time the same hiss, like snow grinding between teeth. Then, faint, something broke through. Navarro? My knees almost buckled. A voice. A real one. Copy. This is Navarro, Station 57. Requesting evac. Do you read? Hold. Navarro. 2 days. Blizzard. Hold. The transmission fractured, words torn apart by interference. But it was enough. Rescue was possible. 2 days. I could last that long. I had rations, water, ammunition. I just had to hold. That's when the console flickered. The static shifted, smoothed, and out of it rose a different voice. My own. Copy, Navarro, it said, calm, steady. We're coming for you. Just step outside. Just follow the lights. The hair on my arms bristled under layers of fabric. My finger froze on the transmit key. Don't listen. The carved words burned in my mind. I slammed the radio off so hard the panel cracked. The silence afterward was worse than the voices. Because now I knew. Whatever this thing wasn't just whispering. It was listening. It was learning. I turned every light in the station on, one by one, until the cabins glowed against the snow like a beacon. Maybe the real rescue could see it. Maybe it would drown out the shadows. But the longer the bulbs buzzed, the more I realized it wasn't pushing the dark away. It was pulling something in. Shadows stretched where they shouldn't. Corners bent. Reflections in the ice-rimmed windows lagged, just a heartbeat behind my movements. Once, when I looked up, I saw myself standing at the far end of the hall, head tilted, rifle slack at his side, though I hadn't moved. I nearly shot the glass out. Instead, I backed into the comms room, dragging what furniture I hadn't used yet into a barricade. Every soldier knows the drill. Narrow your perimeter, defend what's left. The storm outside rose again, a beast circling its cage. The walls shuddered, rattling nails like teeth. And beneath it, faint, I heard something worse than voices. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin, snow crunching under bare feet. I swallowed hard, lifted the rifle. The steps stopped outside the door, a breath pressed through the crack, steaming white. Then, 3 knocks. I didn't answer. Elias. My sister's voice again, close enough I could hear the tremor. Please. You can't leave me out here. My throat burned. You're dead. Silence. Then softly, so are you. The door handle rattled. I leveled the rifle, finger tight on the trigger. The metal groaned, hinges flexing as if under invisible weight. I squeezed, fired, splinters bursting, smoke filling the room. The sound cracked through my skull. When the echo faded, the door was untouched, but the barricade behind me had shifted. I spun. The lockers I'd dragged across the far wall now stood crooked, as if someone had shoved from the other side. And in the space they'd left, words had been scratched into the paint. Open it. My skin crawled. The letters were still wet with frost, steaming faintly in the heat of the room. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls apart with my bare hands, but rage was safer than fear. Rage kept me alive. I grabbed a flare, thumbed the striker, and stared at the door. You want me outside? You'll have to drag me. The storm screamed. The station groaned. Every bulb popped at once, plunging me into black. And in that black, the voices returned. Not whispers now, not laughter, but a single, unified chant, rising and falling like waves. Elias! 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 I jammed the flare against the floor, sparks catching, red fire bursting into life. The chant wavered. Shadows rippled against the walls, twisting, knotting into forms that almost looked human. Long arms, too many joints, mouths stretched too wide, dozens of them circling just outside the fire's reach. The flare hissed, burning down, my chest heaved, sweat freezing on my skin. I knew what would happen when it died. I had one choice: run into the storm or die in this box. I slung the rifle, yanked open the door, and stepped into the night. The wind tore at me instantly, ripping heat from my body. The aurora pulsed overhead, green and red bleeding together in frantic arcs. Shadows writhed at the tree line, waiting. The voices rose, layered and maddening. I fired the last flare into the sky. It screamed upward, bursting in a red star above the station. For a moment, the whole world was bathed in crimson light. And in that moment, I saw them. Not shadows, not impressions, bodies. Tall, gaunt things, skin like stretched ice, faces blurred except for mouths, open, grinning, whispering. Their eyes burned with color that wasn't color, light that wasn't light. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all standing still. All watching me. The flare died. Darkness crashed down. I stumbled backward, slammed the door shut, chest heaving like it would split open. My mind spun, but one thought burned clear. Rescue had seen the signal. They had to have. I could hold 2 days. I had to. But even as I whispered it to myself, I heard my own voice answer from the dark. No, you won't. I counted the hours by the hiss of the lantern, by the ache in my ribs each time I dragged air into my lungs. I rationed water, nibbled rations like communion wafers, cleaned the rifle even though I had nothing left to feed it. Routine, always routine. Discipline was my shield, but no shield holds forever. On the second day, the station changed. Subtle at first. Walls groaning at angles that didn't exist, door hinges whispering without movement, reflections in the glass that turned a fraction slower than I did. I kept my eyes forward, but each time I blinked, the room shifted. An inch narrower, an inch darker. The voices had grown bold. No longer whispers in the wind, they pressed against my skull from inside. My own voice told me to lie down, to rest. Ramirez snarled at me for leaving him behind. My sister begged me to open the door. Strangers laughed, children sobbed, languages I'd never heard bled together into a choir of madness. And then the worst. Silence. Silence meant it was watching. By the second night, my resolve was unraveling. The lantern flickered low, shadows lunging at the corners. My body trembled with cold and exhaustion. I tried the radio again, voice cracking as I repeated my coordinates. For an eternity, only static. Then Navarro. Faint, but real. Not my voice, not a mimic. The clipped tone of a transmission. Weather cleared, approaching station, hold position. I nearly collapsed. My throat worked without sound. They were coming. They were coming. They were real. I forced myself to respond. Copy. This is Captain Navarro. I'm here. But even as I spoke, another voice cut in. My own. Negative. Station clear. No survivors. My blood ran cold. Confirm? The rescuer asked. Confirmed, my voice replied. Calm. Steady. Betrayal carved into sound. I slammed the mic, screaming until my throat tore. No, I'm alive. I'm here. Static roared back. Then silence. I dropped to my knees, fists trembling against the console. The thing hadn't just learned to mimic. It had learned to answer. It was cutting me off. The carved words burned in my mind. Don't listen. But what do you do when the thing outside wears your voice better than you do? I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to light. Harsh, blinding light flooding through the window, a search beam, a helicopter. For the first time in days, hope tore through me like fire. I staggered to my feet, nearly tripping over my own gear. The voices screamed in unison, a wall of sound trying to drown me. I shoved through it, shoved through the barricade, ripped the door open, and froze. The helicopter hovered above the ridge, rotors chopping the sky. A cable ladder swung in the storm, rescue crew braced against the wind. But they weren't looking at the station, they were looking at me. And next to me, I turned. Another Elias Navarro stood in the snow, same uniform, same rifle, same bloodshot eyes. His lips moved in sync with mine, my breath puffing double in the frozen air. The crew shouted something I couldn't hear. The doppelganger raised its hand, waving, perfect, casual, like Ramirez might have waved. And the sickening part, they waved back. No, I croaked. I'm real. I'm the real one. The other Elias smiled. My smile. Then he started walking toward the ladder. I lunged, grabbing his shoulder. My glove closed on flesh colder than stone. His face tilted toward mine, eyes blazing with green fire from the aurora. His mouth split too wide, grinning, whispering with my own voice, "Stay." I shoved him back, desperate, screaming into the storm. The crew looked confused, one pointing at me, one at him. For a heartbeat, I thought they'd see the truth. But then the storm swallowed the station again. Whiteout. The helicopter blurred, vanished into snow and wind. The sound of its rotors faded until I couldn't tell if it had ever been there at all. When the world settled, I was alone. Just me and the other Elias, standing 10 feet apart in the snow. His smile faded, replaced by something worse. Pity. Then he stepped backward into the storm. The white closed around him. Gone. I stumbled back inside, slammed the door, collapsed against it. My body shook with cold, exhaustion, rage. My mind clawed for reason, for control, but there was nothing left to hold on to. Maybe they saw me, maybe they didn't. Maybe the storm was never real. Maybe I never made it to the station at all. I don't know. What I do know is this: the radio still hisses. And sometimes when the static thins, I hear my own voice whispering coordinates. Not to rescue, to someone else. Someone I don't recognize. And sometimes, when the aurora bends low enough, I swear I see figures standing in the green light, watching, waiting. I don't know if rescue will ever come, but if it does, I'm not sure they'll save the right man. My name is Captain Darius Kovalenko, Ukrainian Special Forces Spetsnaz trained, son of a miner from Donetsk. I've lived long enough with blood in the snow and the silence of aftermath to know when the air itself is carrying secrets. Out here, in the Arctic Circle, I felt it the moment our snowcat rolled to a halt. The weight of emptiness pressing on the chest, the way the wind seemed to stagger and hesitate as if listening. We were 4 when we arrived, part of a NATO-Russian joint task to investigate what was supposed to be an abandoned research station, relic of the Cold War. Satellites had picked up heat signatures, faint, intermittent, and the brass wanted answers. So they sent us, the disposable soldiers who are trained not to ask why. The station loomed ahead like a scar punched into the ice, gray concrete domes and rusting antennas, some bent by storms, others encased in thick coats of frozen salt. The air stank faintly of diesel that shouldn't have been burning, and when I stepped down from the cat, my boots crunched on ice so brittle it snapped like bones. The cold was a living thing here. It didn't simply bite, it pressed into marrow, seeping in like smoke. I pulled my balaclava tighter, scanning the horizon. The others disembarked behind me, 2 Americans, 1 Norwegian, each trained, each silent. But silence didn't feel natural here. It felt demanded. Inside the first dome, the wind died as if cut with a knife. Our headlamps scanned long corridors of peeling green paint, Soviet warning placards, and frost climbing like veins across the walls. My gloved hand touched a steel door and came away damp, as if the metal itself was sweating. That was the first detail that told me this place wasn't dead. We moved room to room, clearing like we'd done in countless ruins before. But the deeper we went, the more I felt a strange pull, an impression that sound was trailing us. Not echoes. More like something repeating after us, a fraction late. Clear, whispered Eric, the Norwegian, in his low gravel. A second later, I heard it again. Clear. Same tone, same accent, but not from his throat. From farther down the hall. We froze. Weapons came up. My heart pressed hard against my ribs, but training held me still. I gestured for a sweep formation, and we advanced toward the source. The corridor narrowed, lit only by our headlamps in thin cones of white. Frost smoked faintly where our breath hit the air. Nothing. Just locked doors and silence. Still, I knew what I had heard. The unease stayed with me as we set up our initial post in the station's control room. The consoles were dead, layers of frost-coating dials, yet someone had cleared a corner table. A single mug sat there, rim stained with something dark, still wet. I remember the smell most of all. Burnt oil mixed with a sweetness that didn't belong, like rotting fruit. "Someone's here," muttered Taurus, one of the Americans. His voice carried the tension we all felt but didn't want to name. Someone or something. That night, the storm rose outside, battering the domes, making the whole structure moan. We took turns on watch. During mine, I paced the control room, checking windows, sightlines, door locks. That's when I heard it. My own voice. Kovalenko. The syllables cracked the silence like ice splintering on a lake. It wasn't whispered, it wasn't shouted. It was spoken in my exact cadence, the way I'd bark a command under fire. It came from the hallway we'd left sealed behind steel doors. I felt the muscles in my neck tighten, the animal fear curling fast, but discipline forced me still. I raised my rifle, every sense screaming. The others didn't stir. Somehow, only I had heard it. Or perhaps it had been meant only for me. For the first time since arriving, I considered that this mission wasn't recon. It was a burial. I didn't sleep after that. A soldier learns to sleep anywhere, in ditches, in barracks with 20 others snoring, even under shell fire. But not here. Not when your own name calls you from behind sealed steel. At 400, I handed watch over to Eric without a word. His sharp blue eyes lingered on me, noticing something unsettled, but he didn't ask. In his silence, I knew he'd already felt it too. The storm eased by morning. Pale light filtered through the station's high-slitted windows, blue-gray and sickly, never quite warm enough to remind you of the sun. The snow outside had shifted in the night, sculpted into ridges and valleys like ribs beneath skin. Looking out, I thought of graves. We moved in pairs to sweep another section, laboratories this time. Their walls bore charts in Cyrillic, faded with age, biological hazard warnings, experimental protocols. One room had shattered glass tanks, lined with frost and dark stains inside like shadows of things long dissolved. Another contained racks of tape reels, their spools frozen solid. Taurus cursed under his breath. Whatever they did here, they weren't just studying weather. I said nothing. My gut told me he was right, but it also told me the truth wouldn't help us now. It was in the laboratories that I heard it again. Not my name this time. Taurus's. Taurus. The voice slipped from the corridor we had cleared minutes before. Same inflection as Taurus himself, but stretched a little too long on the S. It was unmistakable and wrong. He froze, turning toward me, eyes wide. "Tell me you heard that." I nodded once. My rifle tracked the corridor's dark mouth. Eric and Mason, the other American, closed in behind, weapons raised. Nothing moved. Nothing answered when Taurus hissed into the dark. "Who's there?" But the silence after was worse. It was thick, unbroken, as though the station itself held its breath. We pulled back to the control room, wordless agreement. The station wasn't empty. It was listening. Anxiety grew like frostbite. Small things became sinister. The metal beams groaned when the wind shifted, but we heard our own phrases echoed in those groans. When one of us coughed, a faint cough followed seconds later from nowhere. Even our footsteps, sharp and precise, sometimes didn't match. Once I lifted my boot, and I swear I still heard a second step follow. I've been ambushed in cities, stalked in forests, hunted through Afghan mountains. Nothing felt like this. Combat is honest. Bullets cut clean. But here, the enemy was in sound, in reflection, in the mind. By evening, Mason refused to take off his headset. He whispered to himself as if anchoring his own voice, reassuring himself of reality. Taurus kept muttering prayers. Eric stayed cold, but I noticed the tremor in his gloved hands when he reloaded his rifle. Me? I tried to analyze it, break it down like any threat. My occupation taught me this. Anything that tries to frighten you has limits. Fear is leverage. That meant whatever stalked us wanted us weak before the strike. It wasn't random. It was intelligent. But intelligence makes an enemy more dangerous, not less. That night, I checked the perimeter. Frost coated every window, thick enough to blur shapes outside. Still, I caught impressions, shadows passing across the pale glow of snow, too tall and too thin to be men. Their gait was jerky, as though imitating steps without understanding balance. I didn't raise alarm. I just sat there in the glow of my headlamp, rifle across my knees, and let the dread harden into discipline. At 200, the voices came again. This time, all of us heard them. Not single names, not words. Laughter. It began faint from the vents above like children's stifling giggles in class, but it grew, weaving into the hallways, multiplying, bouncing off walls until it filled the entire station. A dozen voices, maybe more. Some high, some low, all wrong. Taurus panicked. He tore at his headset, shouting into the noise, "Shut up! Shut the hell up!" Eric shoved him back, rifle pressed against his chest to steady him. Mason stood with white knuckles on his weapon, his lips moving but no sound coming out, like he was praying without breath. Me? I forced myself forward toward the hallway. My boots echoed sharp. The laughter faltered, thinning like fog in sunlight, until it died altogether. Only my breath remained, fogging in the cold. But in that silence I heard it. One last laugh, low and close, right behind my ear. When I spun, the hallway was empty. By dawn, Taurus was gone. No broken locks, no forced doors, just his rifle leaning against the wall, his pack half-zipped, as though he'd simply stood and walked into the storm. Eric swore under his breath, pacing, demanding a search. Mason refused, said Taurus must have gone mad, that he wasn't our problem anymore. But I knew. Taurus hadn't left of his own will. Something had called him, using his own voice, or ours, and he'd followed into the snow. I looked at the door he must have used. Frost melted there in the shape of a handprint. Not his gloves. Bare skin. I said nothing. There was no comfort in truth anymore. Only survival. The station pressed tighter on us after that. Each step felt rehearsed by something just out of sight. Each word risked being repeated back to us in some distorted form. We started using hand signals more than speech. But silence, I realized, was not protection here. It was invitation. Because in silence, the station filled the void with its own sounds, breathing, shuffling, soft taps like nails across glass. I caught Eric staring at the frost-caked window once, his jaw tight. When I asked what he saw, he whispered, "Me," and I believed him. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something crucial. This danger wasn't hunting us through sight or heat. It was hunting us through sound, through recognition, through the very essence of who we were. And once it knew your voice, your rhythm, your name, it owned a piece of you. That's when I understood why Taurus was gone, and why it kept calling me, in my own cadence, from the locked steel doors. By the third night, the silence in the station was no longer absence. It was presence. Something filled it, pressing against our skulls, shaping itself around our thoughts. I stayed awake, listening to the way the beams and pipes groaned. Every creak had rhythm, patterns, almost language. When Eric shifted in his sleep, the sound came twice, once from him, once from the walls. Mason sat across the room, his eyes hollow, his lips split from the cold. He'd stopped speaking altogether. He kept his rifle across his lap like a talisman, but I could tell he didn't believe in it anymore. Me? I forced myself to catalog, to dissect. I'd been trained for ambushes, for deception. The danger here wasn't claws or bullets. It was a predator that wore the shape of sound. It knew our names, our voices, our laughter. Soon, it would know more. At 0317, I heard Taurus again. Captain. The voice was faint, muffled, like someone calling through snow. But it was him, his exact intonation, the husky rasp he carried from years of smoke. Mason's head snapped up, eyes wild. Eric gripped his rifle and shook his head hard, silently begging me not to answer. I didn't. But the voice came again, closer. Captain, help. I'd heard the same tone from men bleeding out in ruins. It reached into me, clawing at instinct, dragging me to my feet before reason snapped me back. No, I whispered, my breath fogging in the frozen air. That's not him. Mason broke first. He slammed a magazine into his rifle and stormed toward the hallway. We can't just leave him out there. I caught his arm, but he tore free with a strength born of desperation. The door slammed behind him, echoing like a gunshot. We waited, Eric and I, straining to hear. At first, just Mason's boots crunching in the snow. Then his voice. Taurus? Taurus, where are you? And then another Mason answering back. I'm here. Follow. Eric's face drained of blood. He raised his weapon as if the barrel could hold back what we both understood. The phenomenon now had Mason too. We heard the boots fade, swallowed by the storm. No gunfire, no struggle, just silence. Two gone. When I turned back, Eric was staring at the steel doors at the far end of the control room. Frost crawled across them, slow but deliberate like veins. It's behind there, he said flatly. I didn't argue. The doors had been sealed since our arrival. Thick Soviet steel with locking wheels rusted into place. Whatever waited beyond had not needed to open them. It reached us through sound, through thought. That night, I dreamed of voices like hands pulling me under ice. When I woke, Eric was gone too. No broken locks, no sign of struggle. Just his gloves on the table, fingers curled stiff as if gripping something he'd refused to let go. I was alone. 3 days in the Arctic Circle, buried in Soviet concrete, surrounded by an intelligence I couldn't map or shoot or outflank. But soldiers are trained to adapt. I stripped the room of supplies, canned rations, a single gas lamp, ammunition. I built barricades at the doors, though I knew they were futile. Sound doesn't need hinges. Still, the ritual of preparation gave me control. It kept me human. Then I stopped speaking, stopped breathing too loud, stopped moving except when necessary, and the station noticed, because in my silence it began to fill the void again. First, the whispers, fragments of Eric's voice, muttering phrases he'd never said. Over here, clear the corner. Don't leave me. Then Taurus's laugh, but stretched thin, shredded, as if it had been dragged across rusted metal. And then my own voice. Kovalenko. Not from the hall, not from behind steel, from inside the room. I spun, lamp-casting weak circles across the walls. My rifle tracked shadows. Nothing. Then again closer. Kovalenko. It came from the radio on the table, dead since the first day. Frost rhymed the dials, but the speaker glowed faintly red. I raised the rifle, finger tight on the trigger. Every nerve screamed to destroy it, but I didn't fire, because the voice that came next wasn't mine. It was my father's. Darius, son. My father had been dead 10 years, buried in Donetsk soil, lungs rotted by dust from the mines, but his voice now filled the frozen control room, warm, weary, exactly as I remembered. I stood paralyzed, rifle trembling. Son, come home. The words cracked something in me I'd buried beneath years of orders and operations. My throat tightened, my breath hitching, the voice softened, coaxing. You've done enough. Rest now. Just follow. The steel doors behind me groaned, frost splitting as if something pressed from the other side. I almost moved, almost obeyed. But then I remembered Taurus, his bare handprint in the frost. I remembered Mason answering himself, Eric seeing his own reflection in the glass, and I realized the phenomenon wasn't just repeating voices. It was learning, adapting, testing. It had reached into my memories. It had found my weakest place. That's when fear sharpened into clarity. It didn't want us dead, not yet. It wanted us emptied, hollowed out until there was nothing left but the echoes it could wear. I lasted another day in that tomb of concrete and steel before silence itself became unbearable. The Arctic light never changed. It hovered on the horizon like a pale bruise, never rising, never setting. I marked time by the growl of my stomach and the crackle of ice shifting in the walls. But the real measure of time was how long I could hold my own thoughts before something else slipped in. At first, the voices came only when I moved, when I acted. But now, they came even in stillness. Inhalations became whispers. My pulse became footfalls. Sometimes I couldn't tell if the voice in my head was mine or something wearing my cadence. By the second night alone, I understood. Silence wasn't protection. Silence gave it room to grow. So I started talking, not to it, but to myself. Orders, protocols, small prayers I hadn't spoken since my mother forced me to church. Anything to keep the rhythm mine. But the station noticed, and it answered. The first breach came through the steel doors. I'd set up my lamp again, the flame low and trembling. The frost across the steel had spread like veins, but now the pattern moved. Slowly, deliberately, the frost pulled into shapes, lines curving like letters, though not Cyrillic, not Latin. A script that bent in on itself, alive in its geometry. Then the doors began to shake. Not violently, subtly. A hum deep in the hinges, as if something vast pressed its weight against them. My teeth ached with the vibration, and then the sound came. Not a voice, not laughter, every voice. Taurus's shout, Eric's curses, Mason's desperate pleading, my father's weary sigh, my own barked commands. All layered, overlapping, tumbling over one another until they fused into a single tide of sound. It wasn't calling anymore. It was demanding. The wheel lock began to turn, slowly, against rust, against time. I should have fired. I should have raked that door with bullets until my magazines were empty, but instinct told me the steel wasn't protection anymore. It was a threshold, and once it opened, there would be no sealing it again. So I improvised. I tore open the control panels, pulling wires with bare hands until the copper sliced my palms. The old Soviet grid still carried charge, enough to matter. I rerouted what power I could to the steel doorframe, rigging it crude but effective. When the wheel lock ground another quarter turn, I pulled the knife switch. Sparks burst. The frame glowed faintly blue. The hum of the door shifted into a screech, high-pitched, animal. The voices cut off. The frost retreated like spilled mercury, slithering back across the steel until the surface was bare again, and for a moment, silence truly returned. My body shook, muscles seizing from adrenaline, but my mind was clear. I had wounded it, not killed it, but hurt it enough to push it back. That clarity lasted until the radio clicked on again. Darius. The voice wasn't mine this time. It was Eric's, but not the frantic Eric from 2 nights ago. Calm, steady, like when he'd first arrived at the station before the fear sank teeth into him. It's not what you think. I froze, rifle raised toward the radio. You fight it, you lose. That's what it wants. It wants you to waste yourself. The radio hissed, then carried Taurus's tone, measured, persuasive. You can't kill it, Cap. It isn't meant to be killed. It's meant to be joined. The lamp flickered. My hands tightened on the rifle, then Mason's voice, broken, raw. Please, just open the door. And then finally, my father again. Son, home is right here. My skin crawled, my mind clawed at discipline, but the weight of all those voices bent thought itself. Each syllable pressed into memory, layering over years of training, years of self. That was when I realized this thing didn't just mimic voices, it harvested them. It collected identity like trophies. Taurus, Eric, Mason, they hadn't vanished. They'd been absorbed. Their voices weren't echoes, they were puppets, hollowed out and played back with new strings. And now it wanted mine. The lamp guttered. The room shrank into flickering shadow. My reflection wavered in the frost-laced window. Except it didn't move when I did. My breath stopped. The figure in the frost stared back, my own outline, helmet, rifle, balaclava. But the eyes were wrong. Too wide, too black. It lifted its rifle when I didn't, and then it spoke. In my voice. Kovalenko. Enough. The frost shattered across the glass as if struck from the other side. Shards fell inward, tinkling across the floor. The reflection stepped free of the pain, its boots crunching in perfect time with mine. But mine weren't moving. I fired. The first 3 rounds punched through its chest, spraying shards of ice and vapor. But it didn't fall. It didn't bleed. The sound of my rifle was mirrored instantly, a second burst, identical, firing back from nowhere. Bullets tore into the wall around me, the exact pattern I had just fired. My ears rang. My pulse thundered. And through the haze, I realized the truth. It could replicate not just voice, but action. Anything it learned, it could throw back at me. And I just taught it how to shoot. I dove behind the console as another burst shattered dials and sent sparks flying. My shoulder slammed concrete, pain flaring sharp. The thing's footsteps echoed in sync with my own ragged breaths, closing in. I thought fast, cold. If it mirrored, then the only advantage I had was to give it something it couldn't copy, something irrational, something it couldn't predict. So I did what no soldier should. I screamed, not words, not orders, just a raw animal roar ripping from my throat until my lungs burned. A sound without rhythm, without meaning, without identity. The reflection hesitated, its mouth opened, but no sound came. For the first time, it didn't know how to follow. I emptied the rest of my magazine into the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, fire snuffed, only cold and silence remaining. And in that silence, the footsteps stopped. I sat there in the black, chest heaving, rifle empty. My voice was gone too, shredded raw by the scream. But I had bought myself something rare in this place. Time. Because now I understood the truth. It wasn't the voices that mattered. It was what lay behind them. Memory, soul, identity. And mine was the last left. Darkness was my only ally now. The station hummed faintly with the storm outside, the vibration of wind through vents, the ache of steel expanding and contracting. But the reflection, the mimic, it had retreated into silence with me. I sat with my back against the console, empty rifle across my knees, throat raw from screaming. My body trembled, but not from cold. Fear burns hotter than frostbite. I forced myself to breathe steady, counting, in, out, in, out. Keeping cadence was dangerous, it gave rhythm, but I needed discipline to keep thought from fracturing. Then I heard it, a scrape. Not boots. Fingernails dragging across the concrete floor. Closer, closer. I held my breath. The scrape stopped, then a whisper. Inches from my ear. Breathe. My lungs convulsed, desperate for air, but I clamped my teeth until pain flashed white in my skull. It wanted me to inhale, to obey, to match the rhythm it dictated. Instead, I exhaled. Long, slow, unnatural. The whisper faltered. I had found another weapon. For hours it circled me. I never saw it, not in the dark, not fully. But I felt it move, a presence shifting weight, making the steel groan where it leaned, pressing against the edges of the room. Sometimes it tried voices. Eric again, calm and steady. Taurus laughing, warm as if he'd never panicked. Mason sobbing like a child, my father calling me home. Other times, it tried silence. A silence so total it swallowed even the sound of my pulse, so complete I felt my existence fraying at the edges. That silence was worse, because it was teaching me that I was not necessary, that my voice, my breath, my memory, none of it mattered in the void it carried. I almost gave in then. Almost. At dawn, or what passed for dawn in that Arctic twilight, I made my choice. Staying inside meant death by assimilation. The station was its nest, its cage, its amplifier. Out there in the storm, I had at least the chance of freezing before it consumed me, and freezing was still dying as myself. I packed what little remained, 3 magazines, a flare gun, a coil of rope, a tin of rations. My voice was shredded, but I whispered one phrase to myself as I tightened straps and checked seals. Move fast. Don't stop. Because motion was the only thing the voices hadn't mastered. They could echo sound. They could mirror steps. But instinct, raw, chaotic instinct, that was mine. The outer door groaned as I forced it open, hinges cracking with frost. The wind hit me like a wall, slicing my lungs, dragging needles across exposed skin. The snow outside was blinding, ridges sculpted into monstrous shapes. Behind me, the station moaned, not from the wind, from disappointment. I stumbled into the storm, boots sinking ankle-deep in powder. Every gust carried fragments of voices, but I forced my eyes forward. Whiteout blurred horizon from sky, ground from void. Somewhere behind me, faint and steady, came the crunch of another set of boots, perfectly in step with mine. I broke rhythm. I staggered left, zigzagging across drifts. The echo faltered. Stumbled late. My chest tightened with grim satisfaction. It couldn't match unpredictability, but I couldn't keep that pace forever. After an hour, I found what I hadn't expected. Tracks. Not mine. Not Torres's. Wider. Heavier. A line of impressions in the snow, too clean to have been made in the storm. They led away from the station, out toward a jagged ridge half lost in the white. Every instinct screamed trap. But instincts also told me following tracks was better than wandering blind into death. I pushed on. The wind carried more voices now. Some begged, some commanded, some whispered nothing but my name over and over until it hollowed into nonsense. But the tracks grounded me. They were proof of something material, proof of movement that wasn't just sound. I didn't notice at first when they began to multiply. One set became 2, then 3, then 4. Each identical, each splitting at strange angles, looping back on themselves, circling me in the snow. I stopped dead, and the wind stopped with me. The storm dropped into eerie stillness. The air was too quiet, too heavy, as though the sky itself leaned close to listen. And then through the snow ahead, I saw them. Figures. 3. No, 5. No more, emerging from the white, outlines blurred, features lost in frost. Each one carried my gait, my stance, my rifle, and each one wore my face. I staggered back, boots crunching. They moved with me, steps precise, perfect echoes. One opened its mouth. My voice spilled out. "You're already dead." Another spoke over it. "You've always been here." A third leaned forward, black eyes wide. "Join." Panic surged hot and sharp. My hand closed around the flare gun. I fired into the sky. The red blaze split the white out, searing color across endless snow. For an instant, the figures fractured, their outlines unraveling, their voices overlapping into a screech of static. I ran. The flare's glow died fast, swallowed by the storm. The figures followed, multiplying in my periphery, always the same distance away. Their boots crunched louder, though my own legs ached, slowed. But one thing was different now. They weren't perfect mirrors anymore. Some stumbled when I didn't. Some turned too slow. They were losing rhythm. The realization hit like fire in my chest. They needed me. Without me, they unraveled. That meant if I could outlast them, if I could vanish into the storm without leaving rhythm to copy, maybe I could starve them. But the ridge loomed ahead, jagged teeth of black rock jutting through the white, and the voices grew louder. I knew what waited at the top. The doors. Not steel this time. Stone, waiting to open. The ridge rose like a wall of blackened teeth in the endless white. Each jag of stone was glazed with ice, cutting the storm into howls that almost sounded like words. My body screamed with exhaustion, but fear drove me higher. Fear has always been the truest fuel. The figures followed, always the same distance, always just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes 2, sometimes 10. I never knew how many, because every time I turned my head, they changed. But all of them wore my shape, and all of them whispered in my voice. Kovalenko, son, captain, enough. The snow thickened until the ridge blurred. My boots slipped on frozen rock, hands bleeding through torn gloves as I pulled myself upward. My breath came ragged, each exhale torn away by the wind. Halfway up, the storm went silent again. I froze. No wind, no snow, just stillness. And then ahead of me on the ridge path stood a man. At first I thought it was Taurus, same build, same stance, rifle slung across his chest, his head lifted as I approached, and for a moment I almost believed, but when he spoke, it wasn't Taurus's voice, it was mine. "You don't need to fight." I gripped my rifle tighter, though the magazine was nearly empty. The figure tilted its head, its lips moved exactly with mine as I muttered, "Not real." It smiled, my smile. "You think you are different, but everything you are, your voice, your fear, your memories, we already carry them." I raised the rifle, finger brushing the trigger. The figure didn't flinch. "If you kill me, you kill yourself. Haven't you learned that yet?" Behind me, boots crunched. Dozens of them. I didn't turn. I knew what I'd see, an army of myself, black-eyed, waiting. My rifle shook in my hands. Every instinct told me to fire. Every instinct also told me it was useless. The figure stepped closer. I saw its eyes now, bottomless, black, like pits drilled into ice. It reached out, my hand, my glove. "Join." For the briefest instant, I felt a pull, not on my arm, not on my body, but deeper. Something in me stretched toward it, thin and fragile, like a thread caught in wind. Memories flickered across my mind. My father's tired face, Eric's steady eyes, Torres's laugh, Mason's trembling hands. One by one, each memory was mirrored in the black pits of its eyes, reflected back at me, but twisted, incomplete. And in that moment, I understood the truth. It wasn't just taking voices, it was taking souls. Every man who vanished here hadn't died. He'd been hollowed, broken down into echoes until nothing remained but a voice on the wind, and now it wanted me. I staggered back, pressing against jagged stone. My boots slipped on ice, nearly pitching me into the void below. The figure's hand hung in the air, waiting. "You're already with us," it whispered. "Every word you speak, we own. Every sound you make, we know. You can't escape yourself." Behind me, the chorus rose, my voices, my commands, my prayers, my screams, all bouncing in the snow like 1,000 ghosts. For the first time, I felt my grip on reality tear. What if it was right? What if I was already gone, already one of them, crawling up this ridge only because it let me believe in choice? What if I died back in the control room and this was just the echo of a man stumbling through memories? The wind returned in a sudden, violent gust, as if the storm itself laughed. I closed my eyes. The abyss yawned behind me. The hand waited before me. And I did the only thing left to me. I opened my mouth and sang. It wasn't a song I remembered well. Something my mother hummed when she scrubbed the kitchen floor, a folk tune from before the war. My voice cracked, raw from cold and screaming, off-key and ugly, but it was mine. The chorus faltered. The echoes stuttered. The figure in front of me froze, its black eyes widening, because this wasn't rhythm. This wasn't a command. This wasn't a sound that could be copied. This was memory, a living thing, imperfect, human. The hand twitched. The voices fractured, breaking into static. I screamed the song louder, forcing it past the blood in my throat, bellowing against the storm until my vision blurred and my lungs felt like fire. And then, for the first time since I'd entered the station, the echoes stopped. The silence that followed was not absence, it was defeat. The figure's outline unraveled, snow blowing through its chest, its face dissolving into the storm. The army of shadows behind me collapsed, melting back into white. I stood alone on the ridge, throat bleeding, chest heaving, but victory in this place was fragile, temporary, because as the storm swallowed the last of the echoes, I heard something deeper. Not voices, not laughter, breathing from beneath the ridge, heavy, immense, slow. The figures had only been fragments, echoes, masks. The real thing, the source, was still waiting below. The breathing rose and fell beneath the ridge, vast and patient like the lungs of the mountain itself. Each exhale rattled the snow at my feet. Each inhale dragged at the air around me, as though even the wind belonged to it. The figures were gone, but I knew they hadn't been destroyed. They had retreated, folded back into the source that had birthed them. My song had broken their rhythm, but the silence that followed felt less like victory and more like a reprieve. And now the reprieve was over. The path along the ridge narrowed, twisting down toward a cleft in the stone. The snow was swept away there, not by wind, but by heat, warm breath rolling upwards, steaming against the frozen cliffs. Something lived beneath, or worse, something waited. I descended. Every step carried me deeper into the maw of the ridge, the snow thinning, the stone sweating with frost melt. The air grew warmer, thick, cloying, carrying the smell of rust and rot. My boots scraped rock as the path opened into a cavern, its mouth framed by jagged teeth of stone. Inside, the dark throbbed in time with the breathing. I lit my last flare. The cavern glowed in bloody light, shadows bending across slick walls. And there, sprawled across the stone floor, I saw them. Bodies. Dozens. Maybe more. Some wore Soviet uniforms, patches bleached by frost. Others looked modern, parkas, boots, gear I recognized from expeditions long after the Cold War ended. Their faces were pale, mouths open, eyes blackened hollows. But none were decayed. They looked preserved, frozen, yet not frozen, as if something had kept them here, waiting. And then I realized their chests moved. Slow, in unison, breathing, not theirs, not anymore. They breathed with the cavern. The flare sputtered, shadows jerking like broken limbs. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. One of the bodies twitched, then another. Fingers curled, lips moved soundlessly, and then the voices came. Not from their mouths, but from the cavern itself. Eric, Mason, Taurus, my father, all of them, rising from the stone, reverberating like echoes trapped in a bell. You see now, They whispered together. The flare popped, nearly dying. I shook it hard, but the light dimmed, painting the cavern in faint blood. The bodies on the floor began to sit up. Not fast, not jerking, slowly as though rising to attention. Their eyes opened, all black. I raised my rifle, though the magazine rattled nearly empty. My fingers shook on the trigger. The voices thickened, overlapping into a tide. Not enemies, not death. Continuation. Union. The bodies stood fully now. Rows of them, uniforms and gear blending into a single assembly of hollow men. Their mouths opened as one, and the cavern exhaled hot breath across my face. The flare went out. Darkness swallowed everything. In that darkness, something vast shifted below. The ground trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. The breathing deepened, and for the first time, I heard its true voice. Not mimicry, not echo. A sound older than language, older than men. A vibration that pressed against bone and marrow. A resonance that carried the weight of eons. It didn't speak in words, but I understood. You are mine. My knees buckled, my grip on the rifle slipped, my thoughts scattered, torn away like snow in the wind. I saw myself lying among the rows, chest rising and falling with the cavern, eyes black and empty. I saw my voice joining the chorus, forever trapped, forever repeating. And for one terrible heartbeat, I wanted it. Because surrender meant rest. But soldiers don't surrender. Not to men, not to shadows, not to things that live beneath the ice. I fumbled at my belt, fingers closing around the last weapon I hadn't used. The flare gun. One shot left. I couldn't kill it. Not something this old, this vast, but I could hurt it. I could scar it. And maybe that scar would buy me a way out. The breathing deepened, rattling stone. The body stepped closer, arms reaching, black eyes unblinking. I pressed the flare gun against the cavern floor and pulled the trigger. The explosion of light was blinding, searing the dark into red fire. The cavern screamed, not in voices, but in stone, in air, in flesh. The rows of bodies convulsed, black eyes bursting, mouths opening in silent shrieks. The ground heaved, cracking beneath me. Steam erupted from fissures, filling the cavern with choking heat. And from below, the vast thing shifted. Not defeated, not slain, but startled. The echo of its voice rose, no longer calm, no longer patient. Not yet. The floor gave way. I scrambled toward the mouth of the cavern as rock shattered behind me. The bodies fell into the fissures, vanishing into red glow. The breathing faltered, broken by fire. I burst into the storm outside, snow slashing my face, lungs heaving ragged breath. Behind me, the ridge rumbled, stone collapsing into itself. The cavern sealed, buried again beneath the ice. The breathing stopped. I collapsed into the snow, every muscle screaming, throat shredded raw. For a moment, all I heard was the wind. Just wind. But as I dragged myself upright, staggering into the storm, I knew the truth. It wasn't gone. It was only waiting. Because voices never die. They just find new echoes. And mine was still out here, carried on the wind. The ridge collapsed behind me, a thunder of stone and ice sealing the cavern in a grave it had known before. The snow swallowed the sound quick, as if eager to bury the memory. I stumbled into the whiteout, half blind, half deaf, legs moving only because stopping meant sinking into the snow and letting the cold finish what the voices had started. Each breath cut my throat raw. Each step felt stolen. But I kept moving, because motion was mine. Stillness was theirs. The storm thinned hours later. A dim horizon appeared, blue-gray and endless. My eyes watered against the glare, but relief never came. Because that was when I heard it. Not close, not in my ear, far, carried by the wind across the ice. My voice. Captain. I spun, rifle raised though the magazine was empty. The ridge was gone behind blowing snow, a jagged scar hidden by distance. Nothing followed, but the echo hung in the air, faint, stretched thin. I kept walking. My compass was useless. The needle spun lazy circles as if even metal had lost its direction here. I picked a bearing anyway, chasing the horizon. My boots dragged, the snow swallowing my tracks as soon as I left them. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw another set of tracks beside mine, matching step for step. But when I looked straight, they were gone. The wind howled like a throat without words. And sometimes, beneath the howl, I thought I heard singing. off-key. Ugly, my mother's tune. But I hadn't been singing. I don't know how long I walked. Time meant nothing. The Arctic sky never changed, a bruise frozen on the horizon. Hunger gnawed, my water froze, my hands blistered and bled inside their gloves. But eventually, through the blur of snow, I saw it. A shadow against the ice, angular, metallic. For a moment I thought it was another hallucination, another trick of the phenomenon. But as I drew closer, I knew the shape, a hut, a Poe. Old, abandoned, but real. Soviet supply left to rot decades ago. The door was half buried in drifts. I clawed through with bloody fingers until the wood cracked open. Inside, the dark smelled of dust, not rot. My flashlight beam caught crates, rusted tools, a cot with its canvas torn. It was shelter. I collapsed inside, the wind sealing the door behind me. For hours I lay there, shivering under the weight of frozen tarps, listening to the silence. Not the cavern silence, not the suffocating kind. Just ordinary stillness, broken by the creak of old wood. I almost let myself believe I'd escaped, but as sleep dragged me down, I heard it again. Not outside, not beneath, inside. A whisper threaded through my own breath. Still here. I woke screaming. The echo was gone, but the fear clung to me like frost. My throat was raw, my chest heavy. For a long time, I sat with my back against the wall, rifle across my knees, staring into the shadows. Nothing moved, but I knew. The cavern had collapsed. The ridge had sealed. But you don't kill something like that. You don't bury what was already older than mountains. You survive it. And survival isn't victory. Survival is carrying it with you. When the storm broke 2 days later, I found the sky clear and pale, the ice field stretching endless under the weak sun. In the distance, dark shapes moved. Rescue, maybe. Or another expedition. I didn't wave, I didn't call out, because I didn't trust my own voice anymore. Instead, I walked. One step, then another. The wind carried sound across the ice, faint and fragile. Sometimes I thought I heard my name, sometimes I thought I heard singing, sometimes I thought the silence itself leaned close to listen. But I kept moving, because motion was mine. And as long as I moved, I was still Darius Kovalenko. Not an echo, not yet. My name is Elias Moreau, and I've spent most of my life listening to animals more carefully than I've ever listened to people. I'm a wildlife biologist trained to read patterns in movement, tone, and silence. Wolves have been my obsession for the last 10 years. Their migrations, their hierarchy, their uncanny ability to survive in places where humans would freeze and starve. When I was asked to travel north, far north, beyond the last gas station, beyond the paved roads, into the endless frozen forests of Quebec, to track a wolf pack rumored to have returned after decades of absence, I didn't hesitate. I should have. The forest is not a forgiving place in midwinter. The first thing you notice isn't the snow, it's the silence. Snow absorbs everything, muffling sound until you feel like you're walking in a void. The river near my cabin is frozen solid, the ice so thick it booms like a distant drum when the temperature shifts. The trees stand in endless rows, black against the white, their branches crusted with frost that looks like bone shards in the weak sunlight. The air is metallic, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache when you inhale. At night, it sinks lower than 9 or 30, and every breath crystallizes instantly, a fleeting ghost rising past your headlamp. The cabin they gave me was a one-room shack with a wood stove, a cot, and a table stacked with field notebooks. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd done this sort of work before. What unsettled me was how quickly I began to feel like the forest was listening back. On my first night, as I unloaded my equipment, I heard it. A wolf's howl. Long, rising, and mournful, so clear it felt like it had been piped through the cold air directly into my ear. Normally, wolves don't howl for no reason. They do it to locate each other, to coordinate. But this one sounded like it was waiting for an answer. And I was alone. I reminded myself that I wanted this. I wanted to hear them, to confirm their return. I wrote in my logbook, Day 1, 1900 hours. First vocalization. Lone howl. Location, frozen river, East Bank. But something about the howl clung to me. It was too close, too loud. And yet when I stepped outside with my flashlight and scanned the tree line, nothing moved. The snow was untouched. My breath fogged in the beam, and the silence rushed back in as if the sound had never happened. Over the next few days, I followed tracks in the snow. Wolves have a signature way of moving, straight lines, efficient. I found them cutting across frozen marshes and along ridges, paw prints crisp in the powder. The prints were larger than I expected, and the strides seemed almost deliberate, like whoever made them was making sure I could follow. At night, the howling returned. Always one voice, always the same drawn-out note that echoed too perfectly. I told myself it was a single dispersing wolf, separated from its pack. It wasn't unusual, but still, it never approached, never moved. The call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself were mocking me. By the fourth night, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The howl repeated. Not just once, over and over, the exact same cadence, the exact same pitch, like a recording played back into the air. Animals don't repeat themselves with mechanical precision. Each breath, each call has variation. This one did not. It was flawless. Too flawless. I lay awake on my cot, staring at the wood stove as the metal creaked with heat. Every time I thought the sound had faded, it started again, unbroken, as though waiting for me to believe in it. My chest tightened with the realization whatever was making that sound wasn't a wolf. Or if it was, then it had learned something it shouldn't know. On the fifth day, I hiked farther upriver, snowshoes crunching through the powder. The light was dim, the sun barely a smear behind thin clouds. The cold gnawed at my fingers even through insulated gloves. As I moved, I had the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. Fieldwork had taught me the difference between nerves and instinct. This was instinct. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight, and every sound, every cracking branch, every shifting gust felt directed at me. That was when I saw the tree. A spruce, massive and old, standing apart from the others. Its bark was scarred, stripped in long vertical slashes far higher than any wolf or bear could reach. The marks weren't random, they were patterned. 4 deep gouges, then a space. 4 again. A rhythm, like writing, carved into the living wood. I crouched, breath fogging in the cold air, and touched the marks with my glove. The edges were sharp, fresh, not weathered. Whatever had done this had done it recently. Too recently. That night, the howling was closer. I stepped outside with my headlamp, scanning the snow. The forest stood motionless. My boots crunched as I circled the cabin. Then, directly behind me, the howl rose, so loud it vibrated in my chest. I spun, the light slicing across the tree line. Nothing. But when I turned back toward the cabin, my beam caught something in the snow. Tracks. Wolf prints, leading directly to my door, and stopping. No return trail. My throat tightened. I crouched, scanning the perfect oval pads impressed into the powder. They ended no more than 3 feet from where I stood, as if something had walked up to my cabin, paused, and then simply vanished. I didn't sleep. The stove hissed, wood popping, while outside the howl went on, endlessly repeating, too exact to be real. I gripped the rifle they'd issued me, not for wolves but for bears, and stared at the door until dawn. By morning, the prints were gone. Covered over. Not by wind. There hadn't been any overnight, but by new snow, a thin, perfectly even layer, as if something had swept its hand across the ground and erased them. When I checked my logbook, the pages were damp. My handwriting from the previous night had bled across the paper, though I hadn't spilled anything. The words, tracks at cabin, vanished, looked smeared, blurred as if something had run a wet fingertip across them. And in the silence of the cabin, with the cold pressing in through the seams, I realized something that made the air catch in my lungs. The howl had stopped. After 5 nights of endless repetition, the sudden quiet was worse. The silence wasn't absence. It was waiting. The absence of the howl gnawed at me more than its presence ever had. At least when it was there, I could track it, measure it, analyze it. Silence left me blind. It was the same silence I'd noticed when I first arrived, thick, heavy, unnatural. Only this time, it pressed in on me like a hand against my mouth. I forced myself into routine. That's what you do when panic stalks the edges of your thoughts. You lean on habit, on method. I spent the morning checking my equipment. GPS locator, batteries, rifle, sample kits, all intact. Nothing touched. I told myself the smeared logbook pages could be explained by condensation, that the missing tracks were just drifting snow. But the rationalizations felt hollow, fragile things that broke as soon as I touched them. By midday, I strapped on my snowshoes and left the cabin. I couldn't sit there any longer, waiting for nothing. The sky was a flat white sheet, blending seamlessly with the snowfields, and the forest stood dark and endless on either side of the river. Each crunch of my steps sounded too loud, like I was announcing myself. I went back to the scarred spruce. The marks were still there, long, vertical slashes, fresh and deliberate. I circled the tree, scanning for tracks, but the snow was smooth, too smooth. Not windblown, not drifted. It looked laid, as though some force had pressed a new layer down evenly, erasing everything beneath it. My breath caught when I noticed something else. Above the highest set of gouges wedged into the bark was a tuft of fur. Gray, coarse, wolf-like. I reached for it with my glove, tugged it free, and held it to the light. It looked normal. Too normal. No blood. No skin attached. Almost as if it had been placed there for me to find. That thought stayed with me as I returned to the cabin. I'd always considered myself rational, trained to separate signal from noise. But this was something else. A presence in the forest that didn't just exist alongside me. It was interacting. It was showing me things. Testing me. That night, I decided to test it back. I stoked the stove until the cabin was warm enough to fight off the bitter cold. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark with my notebook open, pen in hand, rifle leaning against the cot. For hours, nothing happened. Just the creak of the wood, the slow drip of melt water from the roof. And then, at 0200, I heard it. Not a howl, a knock. 3 sharp raps on the cabin wall. I froze, pen hovering above the page. The sound had come from the east wall, no more than 6 feet from where I sat. I waited, breath shallow. The silence returned, stretching longer and longer until my pulse slowed and I began to think I'd imagined it. Then, again, 3 knocks. Same rhythm, same spot. I gripped the rifle and stood, stepping as quietly as I could to the door. My hand hovered over the latch, but I didn't open it. Instead, I crouched, peered through the frost-rimmed window. Nothing, just the trees, skeletal in the moonlight. The snow lay undisturbed. I pulled back, heart hammering. When I turned to return to the cot, my eyes landed on the notebook I'd left on the table. My logbook. It was open. I hadn't left it that way. I forced myself to step closer. The last line I'd written before the knocking was still there, 0200 hours, awaiting contact. Beneath it, in a shaky scrawl that was not my handwriting, were 4 words: stop writing about it. The pen lay across the page as if it had just been put down. I stumbled back, rifle clutched tight. My throat was dry, my breath coming fast. There was no one else here. No one had touched that notebook but me. The silence deepened. My ears rang with it. That was when the howl returned. Not distant this time. Directly outside, a perfect, flawless note that reverberated against the walls of the cabin. I lifted the rifle, aimed at the door, and held my breath. The howl cut off mid-tone like a recording stopped abruptly. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, this time on the door itself. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I just remember the thunder of the rifle in the small cabin, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The shot punched a ragged hole through the door. Smoke filled the air, acrid and sharp. Outside, silence, no answering howl, no sound of retreating paws, nothing. I stood frozen for what felt like an hour, muscles trembling, rifle still raised. Eventually, I lowered it, chest heaving. The heat from the stove pressed against my back while the cold from the shattered door seeped in. At dawn, I finally stepped outside. The snow around the cabin was pristine. No tracks, no blood, no evidence I'd fired into anything but emptiness. The hole in the door gaped like an open wound. I should have packed up, called in extraction, but instead I did the one thing I knew was dangerous. I stayed. Because now I had to know. I had to know what it was that mimicked wolves, what knocked on walls, what wrote in my logbook with a hand that wasn't mine. If it wanted to test me, then I would test it back. So that evening, I set a trap. Not a physical one, no steel, no bait, a test of intelligence. I lit a lantern and left it outside the cabin, flickering weakly in the dark. Next to it, I placed a fresh page from my notebook weighed down with a rock. On the page, in bold, deliberate letters, I wrote, "What are you?" Then I waited inside, rifle across my lap, eyes fixed on the crack of light beneath the door. Hours passed. My breath fogged in the cold air seeping through the shot-out hole. The lantern flame danced outside, shadows stretching against the snow, and then without sound the lantern went out. I lunged for the door, yanking it open, the rifle raised. The cold slammed into me, sharp as knives. The lantern lay toppled in the snow, flames snuffed. The page was gone. I stood there, shaking, scanning the tree line. The forest loomed, endless and silent. The snow under my boots crunched softly. Then, faintly from deep within the trees, the howl rose again. Not one voice this time, many. Dozens, layered and overlapping, a chorus of perfect, flawless calls that threaded through the night like wires tightening around my chest. And beneath the sound, carried on the wind, came the whisper of paper tearing. The chorus of howls didn't fade the way real wolves' voices do. They didn't ripple out in waves across the forest. They hung there suspended too perfect, as if the trees themselves were carrying the sound. My training screamed at me that something about the acoustics was wrong. Wolves call in harmony, but never with such machine-like precision. This was a wall of sound, hollow and exact. I slammed the cabin door shut, the broken hole from my gunshot rattling in the frame. The logbook still lay open on the table. My own words stared back at me. What are you? But the page I had left outside, the one weighed down with a rock, was gone. I had watched it vanish. And now I knew. It was with them. I stoked the stove until the metal glowed, until sweat beaded on my forehead despite the ice creeping through the door frame. I told myself to calm down. Fear clouded judgment, made mistakes inevitable. I was here to observe. Even if I had stumbled into something unnatural, the same rules applied. Watch, record, analyze. But my hand trembled as I lifted the pen, the words scrawled in uneven lines. They took the page. They answered with silence. They are not wolves. I couldn't keep still. Every creak in the walls made me flinch. I paced from the stove to the cot, rifle swinging in my grip. The silence outside deepened as though waiting for me to make the next move. When it finally came, it was almost gentle. A scratching sound just above the window. Slow, deliberate. Claw against glass. I froze, pen still in my hand, ink blotting onto the paper. My chest felt locked. My heart beat a drum against my ribs. The scratching continued, moving slowly across the pane, high enough that I couldn't see the source without stepping closer. I forced myself forward. My boots whispered over the wooden floor. The frost on the glass caught the firelight in pale crystals. The scratching grew louder, sharper. When I reached the window, I raised the lamp and peered out. Nothing. Just the trees, black silhouettes against the faint glow of snow. Then I lowered my gaze. Across the frost of the inside window pane were 4 vertical lines. Fresh, sharp, carved into the condensation like someone dragging claws across it from within. I stumbled back, the lamp clattering against the table. My breath came ragged, fogging the air. The scratches hadn't been outside, they'd been drawn on my side of the glass. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the rifle in my lap, eyes fixed on the window, every muscle tight and trembling. By dawn, the marks had melted with the frost, leaving only faint streaks of moisture. The forest looked normal again, clean, white, endless. But I knew better. I decided to push deeper upriver. If this thing wanted me to stay inside and cower, I wouldn't. I strapped on my snowshoes, packed extra rounds, food, and water. The air was sharp in my lungs, the kind of cold that burns your nostrils. The river's ice groaned beneath my steps, deep belly thunder that echoed under the snow. It didn't take long before I felt it. That weight, that gaze. The silence was wrong again. No chickadees, no woodpeckers, not even the groan of shifting trees, just the sound of my own body moving through the landscape. Then I saw them. Tracks. Not wolves this time. Not clean, deliberate paw prints. These were deeper, wider, the pads stretched into unfamiliar shapes as if the snow had resisted holding them. Some prints were clawed, others seemed more like fingers. They wound along the riverbank, weaving in and out of the trees, and they led me to another tree. This one wasn't scarred with vertical lines. Instead, burned into its trunk, literally burned, the wood blackened and charred, were words. Go back. The letters were crude but unmistakable. The bark still smoldered faintly, tiny tendrils of smoke curling up into the gray sky. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning the forest. My breath fogged, dissipated. Nothing moved. Nothing. I should have gone back then. Packed up, called for evacuation. But curiosity is a cruel thing. I had asked a question, and something had answered. I crouched, pulled my notebook from my pack, tore out a page. My hands shook as I wrote, pressing the pencil hard into the paper. Why are you here? I weighed the page with a stone at the base of the charred tree and stepped back. My heart hammered as I waited, the cold creeping through my gloves. Minutes passed. The forest watched. Then, without sound, the page moved. It didn't blow away. It didn't shift. It slid steadily as if an unseen hand had pulled it into the snow. I lunged forward, but by the time I reached it, the page was gone. Swallowed. I staggered back, adrenaline surging. My vision tunneled, the cold burning against my face. The forest was no longer silent. It was breathing. A low hum vibrated through the ground, through the trees, through my bones. And then, faintly, from all directions, the chorus began again. Wolves, dozens of them, howling in perfect unison. Only this time, layered beneath the sound, was something else. A voice. My voice. Repeating the words I had written. Why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. The chorus folded in on itself, the calls echoing until I couldn't tell where they began or ended. The sound wasn't outside anymore. It was inside my head, resonating against my skull. I dropped to my knees, hands pressed over my ears, but it didn't stop. My own voice circled back at me, distorted, rising and falling in endless loops. When it finally ended, the silence was absolute. My ears rang, the world spinning. I forced myself to my feet, legs unsteady, and stumbled back toward the cabin. Every shadow between the trees felt alive, every gust of wind like breath against my neck. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was sinking. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of sudden plunge that makes your lungs seize. I staggered inside, slammed the door shut, and collapsed against the cot. The logbook lay open on the table. Across the page in my own handwriting were 3 words I had not written. We live here. My skin crawled. I reached for the book, but my hand froze halfway. Because as I stared, the ink shifted. Letters blurred, smearing across the paper until new words formed beneath them. So do you. The stove cracked loudly, showering sparks. I staggered back, heart pounding. The cabin walls felt closer, pressing in, and from the dark, just beyond the broken doorframe, the howl rose again. Not perfect this time, not flawless, but human. The human-like howl twisted through the trees, low and broken, as though someone was imitating a wolf but couldn't quite hold the note. It raised the hairs on my arms in a way the perfect howls never had. Imperfection meant closeness. Imperfection meant proximity. I backed toward the stove, rifle clutched tight, eyes locked on the door. The jagged hole I'd blasted through it days ago seemed suddenly enormous, a wound in the cabin's defenses. Snow sifted through the crack, soft and white against the dark floorboards. The fire hissed and popped, throwing unsteady shadows across the walls, and then 3 knocks. This time they didn't come from outside. They came from inside the cabin wall, directly behind the stove. The sound was sharp, wood on wood, echoing in the narrow room. I froze, my breath fogging in the lamplight. The wall couldn't be knocked on. It was the back of the cabin, pressed against a drift of snow 6 feet deep. Nothing could be standing there. Nothing human, anyway. I edged forward, rifle raised, the wood floor groaning under my boots. My pulse thundered in my ears. Slowly, I pressed my ear to the wall. Silence. And then, closer this time, a whisper. So faint I almost believed it came from my own skull. Elias. My name. drawn out, rasping as if spoken through frozen lungs. I staggered back, the rifle trembling in my hands. My vision swam, black creeping at the edges. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. That's when the stove went out. No warning, no gradual dying of flame. One moment the wood glowed red, the next it was black, a dead husk. Darkness surged in, the temperature plummeting like a stone. My breath crystallized instantly, a sharp fog in front of me. I scrambled for my lantern, struck the lighter, flame shaking wildly. The moment the wick caught, the howls began again. Dozens this time, maybe hundreds, cascading across the forest and down into my chest. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, dust drifting from the rafters. I tried to shout over it, my voice cracking, "What do you want from me?" The sound stopped. So abruptly it felt like my heart had been ripped from my chest, and then across the dark room my logbook turned a page. No wind, no hand. The paper just shifted. Slowly, deliberately, I raised the lantern. Words crawled across the blank sheet in fresh ink, as if an invisible pen dragged itself across the surface. "We want you to stay." My knees went weak. The rifle slipped slightly in my grip, the barrel dipping toward the floor. "No," I whispered. My voice sounded small in the stillness. "No, I'm leaving." The lantern flickered, dimmed. For a moment I thought it would go out. Then the writing began again, letters gouged so hard into the paper I thought it would tear. "You are already one of us." The floor creaked. I jerked my head up. In the corner, just beyond the reach of the lantern light, something moved. A shape darker than the dark, hunched low, its outline twitching as though it hadn't decided what form to take. I raised the rifle, finger on the trigger. "Don't!" My voice cracked. "Don't come closer." It didn't move toward me. Instead, it tilted its head, and from its throat came a sound that made bile rise in mine. My voice. Perfect, identical, repeating the words I had just spoken. "Don't come closer! Don't come closer!" I fired. The blast lit up the cabin in white light, deafening, shaking the walls. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the corner was empty. But the voice continued. "Don't come closer." This time, from behind me, I spun, lantern swinging wildly, but the cabin was empty. Just the stove, the cot, the frost-coated window. The words echoed on, faint, repeating like a broken recording until they finally bled into silence. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the cot, chest heaving. The rifle clattered beside me. I wanted to run, to throw open the door and vanish into the forest, but I knew it was worse out there. Whatever this thing was, it controlled the silence, the snow, the sound itself. Out there, I would be deaf and blind. I forced myself to breathe, to think. What would a biologist do? What did you do when faced with a predator you didn't understand? You observed, you tested, you survived long enough to understand. So I picked up the notebook. My hands shook, but I wrote anyway. My pencil dug deep into the page. If I stay, what happens to me? I placed the notebook on the table, stepped back, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The air pressed in, heavy and cold. The lantern hissed, flame shrinking. Then the page turned, and new words bled across it, drawn slowly, one by one. "You become us." The letters spread across the page, long and spidery, filling every blank space. I felt the walls close in, the sound of my own breathing foreign in my ears. My reflection in the window pane wavered, features blurring, mouth moving half a beat off from my own. I stumbled forward, slammed the notebook shut, and shoved it across the table. My chest heaved, sweat freezing against my skin. The silence swelled, pressing against my eardrums until I thought they'd burst. Then softly, just at the edge of hearing, the howls began again. Only this time, they weren't outside, they were inside the cabin, rising from the walls, rising from the cot, rising from my own throat. The sound swelled, deafening, a chorus of perfect, flawless voices, each one of them mine. The sound of my own voice filled the cabin, layered over itself dozens of times, rising and falling in grotesque unison. It was deafening, vibrating through the floorboards, shaking dust from the rafters. My lantern flickered wildly, shadows crawling across the walls as if something moved behind them. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just outside. It was inside me, reverberating against bone, echoing in the hollow spaces of my skull. Every syllable was my own, every inflection stolen, until I could no longer tell if I was screaming or just another note in the chorus. Survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed the rifle, slung my pack over one shoulder, and lunged for the door. The blast of cold air that hit me as I shoved it open nearly knocked me back. Snow whipped in the windless night, fine as dust, filling the air with glittering white haze, and the forest was alive with sound. Howls, hundreds of them, overlapping in perfect mimicry, some low, guttural, some high and keening, but all flawless imitations, too flawless. They didn't ripple outward like a real pack. They were everywhere at once, surrounding me in a cage of noise. I ran. Snowshoes bit into the powder as I stumbled across the river, lantern beam bouncing wildly. My breath tore from my lungs in ragged bursts, freezing instantly in the air. The cold bit deep into my cheeks, but adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't have a destination. I only knew I had to put distance between myself and the cabin. But every time I looked back, it was still there. Not the cabin, something else. A shape, just at the edge of the trees. Black against black, taller than a man, its edges shifting like smoke. It didn't follow directly. It didn't have to. Wherever I turned, it was already waiting, watching. The howls shifted. They no longer imitated wolves. Now they imitated me. "Help!" my voice cried from the tree line to my left. "Don't come closer," echoed from the right. "What do you want from me?" rose from behind, twisted in pitch. I stumbled, dropped to one knee, snow biting through my pants. My hands shook as I lifted the rifle, the hat firing into the dark. The shot cracked across the valley, deafening. For a moment, silence followed, sharp and absolute. Then the chorus resumed, louder, mocking. My own voice repeating the shot itself. Bang, bang, until it became grotesque laughter reverberating through the forest. I forced myself up, legs burning, and pushed onward. The trees thickened, branches clawing at my parka. My lantern guttered, the flame shrinking lower and lower. I clutched it tighter, willing it to last. Without it, I'd be blind. That was when I heard it. A single howl. Not perfect, not layered, real. I stopped, chest heaving, ears straining. It came again, fainter, farther, but different. Organic, not flawless, not one of them. A real wolf. Hope surged in my chest. Wolves avoided humans. If they were near, it meant something in this forest was still natural, still untouched. I turned toward the sound, pushing through the trees, branches snapping under my weight. The snow opened into a clearing, moonlight spilling across the ground. My lantern finally gave out with a soft hiss, leaving me in silver light and shadow. And there it was. A wolf. Gray, massive, fur bristling against the cold. It stood at the edge of the clearing, head raised, breath steaming in the moonlight. Its eyes locked on mine, yellow, sharp, alive. Relief hit me like a drug. For a moment, I believed I wasn't alone. Then it opened its mouth, and my voice came out. Elias. I staggered back, almost dropping the rifle. The wolf's jaws moved again, lips curling, and another phrase emerged, cracked and wet, but still unmistakably mine. Stay. The chorus rose again around the clearing, voices echoing from every direction. My own words, twisted and endless. Stay, stay, stay. I turned and ran, blind with terror. Branches whipped my face, snow dragged at my legs, lungs burning as I forced myself onward. The sound pursued me, not fading but swelling, as if carried in my own blood. At last, the forest opened. My boots struck ice. I had stumbled back onto the frozen river. The cabin loomed on the far bank, a dark silhouette against the snow. But it wasn't empty. Figures stood around it. Dozens. Maybe more. Tall, hunched shapes, each one shifting, edges blurring like smoke and wind. Some had heads too long, some arms too many, but all of them turned toward me in unison. And then they spoke. Not in howls, not in my voice. In unison, layered and inhuman, they whispered a single phrase that carried across the ice and into my bones. You are home. The ice boomed beneath my feet, cracking like a gunshot. I froze, lantern gone, rifle shaking in my hands. The river groaned, fissures racing outward from where I stood. The sound swallowed the forest chorus, leaving only the creak of breaking ice and the pounding of my heart. I had a choice. Turn back to the trees or cross toward the cabin and the waiting figures. Both were death. Both were madness. I ran anyway. The ice shattered behind me, water gaping black as I hurled myself forward. My snowshoes slipped, nearly dragged me under, but I scrambled, clawing my way across the groaning surface. The figures by the cabin didn't move. They only watched, silent, waiting. When I finally reached the far bank, I collapsed into the snow, chest heaving, vision blurring with frost and fear. The cabin stood over me, dark and still, its walls groaning in the windless air. I pushed myself up, staggered to the door, and shoved it open. Inside, the stove glowed red again. My cot was neatly made. The lantern sat on the table, flame burning steady, and on the logbook's open page, in my handwriting, was a final line I had not written. "Welcome back, Elias." The door slammed shut behind me. The cabin was warm, too warm. The stove crackled as if it had been burning all night, but I knew it had gone out. My boots left wet prints across the floorboards as I staggered inside, rifle heavy in my hands. The lantern hissed softly on the table, casting steady light that pushed against the shadows but never quite dispelled them. And the logbook. The words sat there in my own handwriting, dark and neat. "Welcome back, Elias." I stood over it, shaking. My breath steamed in the hot air. My gloves were torn, my knees bleeding through ripped fabric, and still I stared at those words until they blurred. I told myself it had to be exhaustion, delirium, hallucination. But even as I thought it, I felt the weight of eyes pressing in from every side. I wasn't alone. I spun, rifle raised. Nothing moved. Only the faint creak of the walls in the heat, only the gentle hiss of the stove. My pulse thundered. And then, softly, almost beneath hearing, came a sound. A whisper. Not outside, inside. At first it seemed like wind through the rafters. Then it gathered weight, shape, until I recognized the tone. Not a voice, not exactly. More like the memory of one, my father's. He had been gone 10 years. But the cadence was perfect, a low murmur from the corner of the room. "You've come so far, Elias," it said. "Don't leave now." The rifle nearly slipped from my grasp. I backed toward the door, heart hammering, refusing to look at the corner. But the whisper followed, curling close to my ear. "Stay." I slammed the butt of the rifle into the table, knocking the lantern to the floor. The flame went out instantly, swallowed whole, leaving only the faint red glow of the stove. Shadows ballooned, stretching like limbs across the walls. The whisper rose into laughter. My laughter. I stumbled to the door, wrenched it open, and froze. Snow had swallowed the world. The clearing was gone, erased beneath drifts taller than the cabin itself. No trees, no river, no stars. Just an endless field of white stretching out into nothing. The wind was still absent. The snow didn't fall, it simply was. And at the farthest edge of sight, shapes stood. Dozens, hundreds, silent, waiting. I slammed the door. The cabin groaned, wood bending under unseen weight. The whispers multiplied, voices overlapping. My mother, my brother, old friends, long-dead professors. Every voice I had ever known calling out at once. They told me to rest, to stop running. They promised warmth, peace, safety. I pressed my back to the wall, rifle raised, but what good was it? Bullets had no effect. The things out there were not animals, not predators. They were older, more patient, using familiarity as a snare. The stove door rattled, embers flared. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw something moving in the flames, a long face, eyes hollow as sockets, a grin cut too wide. I dropped the rifle. My hands were slick with sweat despite the cold that gnawed at my bones. It wanted me to stay. That much was clear. But why? I forced myself to the table, dragging the logbook closer. My handwriting sprawled across the last entry. Neat, calm. Beneath it, even now, letters formed on the page, black ink seeping up through blank paper, curling into words I had not written. "You are already part of us." The logbook snapped shut in my hands. I hurled it into the stove, pages catching in an instant, curling black. But the words burned into my mind even as the book vanished in flame. Something inside me shifted. A heaviness pressed against my skull as though thought itself no longer belonged to me. For one terrifying moment, I wanted to stay. I wanted the warmth, the voices, the end of fear. But then I remembered. The wolf. The real one. Its howl, flawed and imperfect, not a mirror of me. The reminder that something in this forest still lived outside their imitation. That was my thread, my proof that I could still leave. I grabbed the pack, slung it onto my shoulders. My rifle lay abandoned. My body shook so violently I could barely stand, but I forced myself toward the door. The voices screamed as I pulled it open. Heat vanished. Cold roared in. The whiteness outside pulsed, a living void. The figures at the horizon turned as one. I stepped out. Snow swallowed my boots to the knee. My legs ached, lungs seared, but I moved. One step, then another. My name echoed from every direction, drawn out in agony. Elias, Elias, Elias. I didn't answer. The cabin behind me groaned once more, then fell silent. I didn't look back. I walked until my body became machine, until sensation dulled into numb persistence. Time lost meaning in the white. My mind blurred, slipping in and out of thoughts that weren't mine. And then, sound, a howl, low, ragged, imperfect. I froze. Somewhere in the white expanse, far ahead, it called again, not flawless, not human, alive. I stumbled toward it, vision tunneling. Each step felt heavier, as if snow clutched at me, dragging me down. Shadows swam at the edge of my sight. Whispers crowded my ears, promising relief if I only stopped, only lay down and let the cold take me. But I pressed on. The howl rose once more. Closer, my chest burned, black spots dancing in my vision. Then a shape resolved in the snow, gray fur, yellow eyes gleaming. The wolf. It stood motionless, watching me. Its breath steamed, and for the first time since this began, the chorus fell silent. I fell to my knees, gasping, staring into those eyes. They were not human. They were not mine. They were real. And as darkness closed in at the edges of my vision, I clung to that one certainty. Something lived here that was not them. When I woke, if I woke, I didn't know what I would find. The snow hissed around me. The wolf's eyes burned steady, and then the silence broke. Not with my voice, not with theirs, but with a sound deeper, older, rolling up from beneath the earth itself, a growl that shook the snow from unseen branches above. The wolf raised its head, answering with its own howl, raw and ragged. I never heard what came after. The darkness took me before I could. And still, as I write this with trembling hands, I don't know if I survived. I don't know if I ever left that cabin, or if I'm still there, listening to my own voice echo in the rafters. All I know is this: the forest remembers. It waits. And if you hear your own voice calling you from the trees, don't answer, because once it knows your name, you'll never leave.